My wife Willow and I have been childhood sweethearts since we were little. Yet what I never could have imagined was this. I loved her more than my own life, but she hated me with all her heart. After I lost my memory, she even became determined to take revenge on me. And what I never expected even more was that the way she planned to get revenge was by swearing to have 8 children and make me raise them. Chapter 1. In a city, there were 2 corporations that everyone knew about, Wang Group and Lu Industries. The two stood shoulder to shoulder at the top of the business world and had dominated the market for decades. By pure coincidence, the 2 families' mansions stood right next to each other, separated only by a hedge that stayed green all year round. That hedge had witnessed far too many stories. George Wang, the only son of the Wang family, and Willow Lu, the precious daughter of the Lu family, were born on the exact same day. Yes, it was really that much of a coincidence. Oh my, your Willow is amazing. She can already recite classical poems at the age of 3. Mrs. Wang beamed from her garden across the hedge. Oh, not at all. George is the impressive one. He can already introduce himself in English. Mrs. Lu held an exquisite bone china teacup and smiled even more brightly. The moment the conversation ended and they turned away, their expressions changed instantly. Mrs. Wang whispered to the nanny, "Add another traditional literature class for George tomorrow." Mrs. Lu quietly instructed her assistant, "Arrange a French tutor starting next week." And so, under the relentless competition between their mothers, George and Willow's rivalry officially began. At 4 years old, George was playing with a remote-controlled airplane in the yard. Willow watched from across the hedge for a while before turning and walking back inside. 20 minutes later, her own remote-controlled airplane took off, and it flew just a tiny bit higher than George's. Humph. Willow lifted her chin proudly. TCH. George pouted. At 7, they both enrolled in the most expensive private elementary school in a city. On the day of a parent-teacher conference, the homeroom teacher announced with a bright smile, "Willow scored a perfect score in mathematics this time. Everyone should learn from her." A reserved smile had just appeared on Mrs. Lu's face when the teacher continued. However, George not only got a perfect score in mathematics, but also a perfect score in Chinese. Let's give him a round of applause. Mrs. Wang's laughter rang out as brightly as silver bells. The smile on Mrs. Lu's face froze for a fraction of a second. That night, 10 advanced mathematics workbooks mysteriously appeared on Willow's desk. "Mom, I want to watch cartoons," Willow said pitifully. "Willow, do you know what happened today? That brat from the Wang family got one more perfect score than you. Do you want your mother to lose face in front of Aunt Wang?" 7-year-old Willow fell silent for a moment. Then she nodded solemnly. That night, she had a dream. In the dream, she tore all of George's perfect test papers into pieces and stood on the shredded pages while laughing triumphantly. When she woke up, she thought she was a genius. At 10 years old, the 2 families attended a business gala together. While the adults mingled and chatted, George and Willow were placed in a lounge so they could supposedly bond. George raised his chin. "I heard you won first place in that piano competition." Sitting on the sofa with a glass of juice in hand, he carried himself like a miniature adult. "I heard you did too." Willow sat at the opposite end of the sofa, also holding a glass of juice and looking just as mature. George replied smugly, "I was ranked first in the entire city." "So was I." The two exchanged a glance. Invisible sparks crackled in the air. George set down his juice. "Then let's compete." As he spoke, he walked toward the piano in the corner of the lounge. Willow immediately fired back. "Fine, let's do it." The 2 10-year-olds took turns performing piece after piece. Each selection was more difficult than the last. From Für Elise to Fantasie Impromptu, from Hungarian Rhapsody to La Campanella. By the end, both of their fingers were so sore they could barely lift them, yet neither was willing to stop first. Only after the gala ended and the adults entered the lounge did they discover the brutal piano duel. One uninformed guest laughed and remarked, "Look at them. Those 2 kids must be such good friends. They're even playing the piano together." George and Willow turned simultaneously toward the guest. The "Are you kidding me?" written all over their faces instantly froze the man's smile. Mrs. Wang quickly stepped in to smooth things over. "They're exchanging musical ideas. They've grown up together since childhood. Their relationship is wonderful." George and Willow turned toward Mrs. Wang at exactly the same time. This time, even Mrs. Wang almost failed to keep her smile in place. Chapter 2. At 14, they enrolled in the same elite private high school. By then, George had grown into a handsome young man with sharp features and a cool, reserved demeanor. He was universally recognized as the school's most popular boy. Willow, meanwhile, had blossomed into a graceful beauty with bright eyes and a dazzling smile, becoming the school's most admired girl. To their classmates, the 2 looked as if they had stepped straight out of a novel. A perfect match. George and Willow look so good together. They're neighbors too, childhood sweethearts. I'm totally shipping this destined couple. Someone arranged the wedding already. These comments inevitably reached their ears. On the surface, George remained calm and indifferent. Inside, however, he was thinking, shipping every pair you see is a disease. Willow wore a polite smile on the outside as well. Inside, she was thinking, you people must be seriously starved for entertainment. But their upbringing would never allow them to voice such thoughts in public. So they endured the discomfort and maintained a facade of courtesy. Willow, this is yours. One afternoon after school, George stopped her at the front gate and handed her a manila envelope. It contained student council documents. Their parents had forcibly stuffed both of them into the student council, claiming it would help develop leadership skills. Thank you. Willow accepted the envelope with a polite smile. Under the setting sun, the handsome boy and beautiful girl stood together. The scene looked like a painting. Passing students immediately wore the expressions of people witnessing their favorite romance come to life. One excited girl even squealed. They're in the same frame. This is so sweet. Hurry up and hug already. What nobody realized beneath that picturesque scene was, as George handed over the envelope, one of his fingers just so happened to press against the sealed flap. A little glue squeezed out and smeared onto Willow's hand. The sticky sensation nearly made her lose her composure on the spot. In response, Willow very casually, and very deliberately, stepped on George's foot. The thin heel of her shoe nearly made him cry out in pain. The two smiled at the same time. Then they turned away at the same time. The instant they turned around, both smiles disappeared. That jerk! Willow cursed inwardly while pulling out a wet wipe and aggressively scrubbing the glue from her hand. That wicked woman! George cursed inwardly as he limped toward his family's car. When the cars finally pulled away, they exchanged one last glance through the windows. Then both immediately looked away, and spent the ride mentally roasting each other 10,000 times over. Time flew by. Before they knew it, both had graduated from prestigious overseas universities and returned home. George Wang joined Wang Group. Officially, he held the title of vice president. In reality, he was the heir, beginning his training to take over the family empire. Willow Lu joined Lu Industries. She also carried the title of vice president, and she too was preparing to become the next successor. The two companies operated in highly overlapping sectors: real estate, technology, investments. Everywhere one looked, they were competitors. And these two young vice presidents perfectly carried their lifelong rivalry into the business world. Whenever Wang Group bid for a piece of land in East City, Lu Industries would inevitably submit a competing offer. And somehow, it was always just a little higher. Whenever Lu Industries invested in a technology project, Wang Group would inevitably get involved. And somehow, their terms were always just a little better. Before long, a common saying spread throughout a city's business circles. Wang Group and Lu Industries were sworn rivals. Yet strangely enough, despite competing at every turn, they maintained a delicate balance. Neither side ever tried to destroy the other. Even more puzzling was the fact that the heads of the two families, George's father and Willow's father, actually got along quite well in private. They frequently played golf together. This left countless spectators thoroughly confused. What confused them even more was that, after the children had grown up, the two mothers seemed particularly enthusiastic about finding opportunities to push George and Willow together. Chapter 3. One evening during dinner, Mrs. Wang casually asked as if the thought had just occurred to her. George, do you know what project Willow has been working on lately? George paused briefly while picking up food. I don't. How could you not know? Don't you see each other at business events all the time? Mom, George replied. Those are business occasions, not social gatherings. They're basically the same thing. I ran into Willow at the beauty salon yesterday. That girl gets prettier every year. She has such elegance, such poise, and she's so articulate. Don't you think so? George set down his chopsticks and looked at his mother. Mom, what exactly are you trying to say? Mrs. Wang smiled warmly. What could I possibly be trying to say? I just think the two of you are a great match. You've known each other since childhood. You understand each other's backgrounds. Your families are on equal footing, and you're both highly capable. Mom. George cut her off. Willow and I are impossible. Why impossible? Because every time I see her, my stomach hurts from sheer frustration. Unfortunately, that wasn't something George could actually say out loud, so he chose a more diplomatic answer. Our personalities aren't compatible. Mrs. Wang frowned. How are they not compatible? You're both outstanding young people. You both graduated from top universities and have thriving careers in business. Mom, I still have work to do. George stood up and headed upstairs without another glance back. Mrs. Wang watched her son's retreating figure and sighed. Then she picked up her phone and sent Mrs. Lu a message. Are you there? I tested the waters a little. That boy is still stubbornly denying everything. How's Willow doing on your side? Mrs. Lu replied almost instantly. Don't even mention it. I barely brought up the subject. And she practically had not a chance written across her face. Tell me, how did these two kids end up getting along so badly? Mrs. Wang responded. Getting along badly. Sigh. They're both incredibly competitive. We spent their entire childhood comparing them to each other. Now they look at each other like sworn enemies. Mrs. Lu replied. So what do we do? Just let this drag on forever? My husband said that if the Lu and Wang families became related by marriage, the entire business world of a city would be solid as a fortress. My husband thinks the same way. Besides, I've watched Willow grow up since she was little. I know exactly what kind of person she is. That's far better than some unknown girl from outside. Mrs. Lu quickly responded. I like George too. He's mature, capable, and never gets involved in scandals. Willow is so stubborn. She needs someone who can keep her in line. Mrs. Wang sent back. Great minds think alike. So, shall we put in a little more effort? Mrs. Lu replied immediately. Absolutely. After setting down their phones, both women wore the same determined smile. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, George and Willow remained completely unaware of this conspiracy. Well, not entirely. They knew their parents were trying to set them up, but both believed that as long as they firmly refused, their parents couldn't exactly drag them to the marriage registry office by force. What they didn't know was that the author was about to intervene. Chapter 4. Old Master Wang's 80th birthday celebration was a major event for the entire business world of City A. Old Master Wang was the founder of the Wang Group and a highly respected figure in the business community. For his birthday banquet, nearly every influential person in City A would be in attendance. Naturally, the Lu family was among the invited guests. The banquet was scheduled for Saturday evening at the most luxurious hotel owned by the Wang family. They had reserved the entire ballroom, decorating it in dazzling splendor and unmatched grandeur. As the eldest grandson of the Wang family, George Wang had been busy since early morning, greeting guests, arranging seating, confirming the event schedule. He barely had a moment to rest. At 5:30 in the afternoon, just as he finally caught a brief break, Mrs. Wang came looking for him. George, Mom needs a favor. The moment George saw the smile on his mother's face, his heart sank. Every time Mrs. Wang wore that smile, trouble was sure to follow. What is it? That child Willow is still working overtime at the company this afternoon and hasn't come over yet. I'm worried it's not safe for her to drive alone while rushing over. Could you go pick her up? George's expression instantly became complicated. Mom, the Lu family has a driver. Their driver took the day off. She can drive herself. She's wearing high heels today. It's inconvenient for her to drive. Mrs. Wang had one reason after another, clearly having prepared them in advance. Mom, George, today is your grandfather's birthday banquet. Willow is our guest. Do you really think it's appropriate to let a guest rush over by herself? Mrs. Wang's tone became serious. Besides, it's on your way. How much time could it possibly take? George took a deep breath. He knew there was no getting out of this today. Fine, I'll go. The seriousness on Mrs. Wang's face instantly vanished, replaced by a smile as bright as a flower. That's more like it. Hurry along, and drive safely. With a dark expression, George walked out of the hotel, got into his car, started the engine, and headed toward Lu Industrial Holdings. His grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. Pick up Willow, on the way. Yeah, right. He had been busy all day and had finally gotten a chance to rest, only to be sent to pick up the woman who made him feel uncomfortable every time he was around her. What made it even more frustrating was that he couldn't refuse. It was his grandfather's birthday banquet. Guests couldn't be neglected, even if that guest happened to be Willow. George mentally replayed his mother's little scheme over and over again. The more he thought about it, the more irritated he became. Meanwhile, in the vice president's office at Lu Industrial Holdings, Willow was reviewing the last document of the day. She had indeed worked overtime and had fully intended to drive herself to the banquet. But 10 minutes earlier, Mrs. Lu had called to tell her that a car from the Wang family would be coming to pick her up. A car from the Wang family? Why? Willow had immediately become suspicious. You silly girl, the Wang family is simply being considerate. They're worried you might be in a hurry, so they're sending a car to pick you up. Why would you object? Mrs. Lu replied as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Willow fell silent for a moment. There's no need. I'll drive myself. Willow, don't be stubborn. Today is Grandpa Wang's birthday banquet. They're being thoughtful, and it would be rude to keep turning them down. Besides, I've already agreed. You can't expect me to go back on my word, can you? After hanging up, Willow tossed the document heavily onto her desk. The Wang family was sending someone to pick her up. That had to be Aunt Wang's idea. Over the years, Aunt Wang and her own mother had been relentlessly trying to pair her up with George. Their determination bordered on obsession. The most annoying part was that she couldn't easily refuse. Respect for her elders and basic social etiquette left her with no choice but to wait obediently for the Wang family's car. Glancing at the time, Willow packed up her things and headed downstairs in her high heels. She stood at the entrance of the company as the evening breeze carried the faint warmth of early summer. She wore a simple champagne-colored dress paired with matching heels. Her makeup was flawless, her posture elegant and confident, drawing the attention of passers-by wherever she stood. Expressionless, Willow stared toward the street corner, waiting for the car she dreaded to appear. Chapter 5. 5 minutes later, a black Maybach slowly pulled up and stopped in front of her. The door opened, revealing George's face, the same face she had been looking at for more than 20 years, and the more she looked at it, the more annoyed she became. "Get in." George's voice was indifferent, skipping even a simple greeting. Suppressing her irritation, Willow got into the car and sat in the back seat. She wouldn't even consider sitting in the front passenger seat. Just the thought annoyed her. The silence inside the car was almost unbearable. Neither of them had any intention of speaking. George kept his eyes on the road, focused on driving. Willow looked out the window, pretending to enjoy the scenery. The air inside the car seemed frozen. Every second felt suffocating. Working overtime today. At last, George broke the silence. It wasn't because he wanted to chat. The atmosphere had become so awkward that staying silent felt even stranger. Willow answered with a single syllable. Silence returned. George rolled his eyes internally. "Fine, if you don't want to talk. I don't want to talk either." He pressed down on the accelerator, increasing the speed. His only thought was to get this woman to the hotel as quickly as possible, complete the task his mother had assigned him, and stay as far away from her as he could afterward. The car traveled along the main road in the eastern part of the city. The sky gradually darkened, and the streetlights flickered on. Ahead was an intersection. The traffic light was green. With 10 seconds remaining, George estimated the distance. There was plenty of time to pass through normally. The car entered the intersection. At that moment, a deafening roar of an engine came from the left. George turned his head, and his pupils contracted. A heavy truck, traveling at no less than 50 miles per hour, had run a red light and was charging straight toward the driver's side door. Everything happened in an instant. A tremendous crash, the screech of twisting metal, the shattering of glass. All the sounds merged into one chaotic explosion. The airbags deployed. The seatbelt dug into his body. The violent impact instantly blurred George's consciousness. In the final moment before he blacked out, he vaguely heard a short, sharp scream from the back seat. Then everything went dark. George felt as though he were slowly rising out of a thick sea of darkness. His head hurt terribly, as if someone had struck it with a blunt object. His body felt heavy. Every muscle weighed down like lead. It took tremendous effort just to crack his eyes open. The harsh white light made him shut them again instinctively. After a few seconds, he slowly opened them once more. A white ceiling, white walls, white sheets, the strong smell of disinfectant. A hospital. He tried to move, only to discover a neck brace around his neck and an IV tube inserted into his arm. "He's awake! He's awake! Doctor! The patient is awake!" An excited voice rang out nearby. George turned his head and saw Mrs. Wang's bloodshot eyes. "George, how do you feel? Are you dizzy? Does anything hurt?" Mrs. Wang gripped his hand tightly, her voice trembling. George opened his mouth and found his throat painfully hoarse. "What happened?" "You were in a car accident. A truck ran a red light and hit your car." Mrs. Wang's eyes filled with tears. "You were in the ICU for 2 days. You scared your mother half to death." George frowned. "A car accident?" He tried to remember, but his mind was completely blank. Nothing came back. No, not just the accident. He couldn't even remember who he was. Struggling to speak, he said, "I don't remember." Mrs. Wang's expression changed instantly. "Don't remember what?" "I don't remember anything." George closed his eyes, then opened them again. "Who am I? Where is this?" Mrs. Wang finally broke down in tears. What followed was a series of examinations. Doctors surrounded George for hours, asking questions and conducting tests. In the end, they reached a conclusion. Amnesia. The concussion from the accident had caused retrograde amnesia, resulting in the temporary loss of his past memories. As for when those memories would return, even the doctors could not say. It could be a few days, it could be a few months, or it could take much longer. Fortunately, the doctor said, his cognitive abilities and language skills have not been affected, and there are no serious physical injuries. He simply needs time to recover. It was the closest thing to good news they could offer. George leaned against the hospital bed and looked at the people gathered around him. A middle-aged couple who claimed to be his parents, a young man who claimed to be his assistant, several people who claimed to be executives from his company. He recognized none of them. The feeling was strange. It was as though he had been thrown into the middle of a movie where everyone else knew the script, and he was the only one who didn't. Chapter 6. He asked, "You said there was another person in the car with me?" Mrs. Wang nodded. "Yes, it was Willow. She's also in the hospital, right next door. She woke up today as well, and she has amnesia too." George showed no reaction. The name Willow meant absolutely nothing to him. Mrs. Wang cautiously asked, "Would you like to go see her? Maybe it'll help you remember something. You were brought to the hospital together." George thought about it for a moment and nodded. It wasn't that he was particularly curious about this Willow. His mind was completely blank right now. He couldn't remember anything. Perhaps seeing someone who was going through the same thing might trigger something. With the nurse's help, George was seated in a wheelchair and pushed to the room next door. The door was open. He saw a young woman sitting on the hospital bed. She wore the same hospital gown as he did. A bandage was wrapped around her head, and her complexion was slightly pale. Even so, her delicate features and elegant presence were impossible to miss. At that moment, she was leaning against the headboard, listening blankly to the people around her speak. The expression on her face was probably identical to the one he himself had worn earlier. The nurse knocked lightly on the door. "Miss Lu, Mr. Wang is here to see you." The young woman on the bed looked up. Their eyes met. The instant it happened, George's heart slammed violently against his chest. Thump, thump, again and again. Suddenly, he found it hard to breathe. Something seemed lodged in his chest. A powerful emotion surged wildly through him, making his heart race so fast it felt as though it might leap out of his throat. He froze, then instinctively pressed a hand against his chest. What is happening? Why am I reacting so strongly just from seeing her? Meanwhile, Willow was experiencing exactly the same thing. The moment she saw George, her heartbeat accelerated. Her cheeks grew warm. The tips of her ears burned. It felt as though all the blood in her body was rushing toward her head. Her first thought was, "This guy is incredibly handsome." Her second thought was, "Why is my heart beating so fast when I look at him?" Her third thought was, "Could it be? Was I secretly in love with him before I lost my memory?" The two stared at each other, one sitting in a wheelchair, one leaning against a hospital bed, both with hearts pounding like drums, both lost in a whirlwind of thoughts. Neither of them knew that the reason for their racing hearts was actually a deeply ingrained instinct hidden within their subconscious. Every time they saw this person, they got annoyed. Amnesia had erased the reason for that annoyance, leaving only the physical reaction behind. And two lifelong singles who had never been in a relationship came to completely incorrect conclusions. Willow thought, "I've heard that your heart races when you see someone you like. So, does that mean he was my crush?" George thought, "I've heard that love at first sight makes your heart pound. So, did I fall in love with her at first sight?" They both looked away at the same time. Then both secretly glanced back. Their eyes met again. They both immediately looked away again. To their parents, the scene was almost too beautiful to be real. Mrs. Wang and Mrs. Lu exchanged a glance. The excitement in their eyes was practically overflowing. With a smile, Mrs. Wang introduced them. "George, this is Willow. The two of you grew up together. You were childhood sweethearts and always had such a wonderful relationship." "Yes, yes," Mrs. Lu quickly added. "The two of you were inseparable when you were kids. You went to school together and came home together. The neighbors always said you were like brother and sister." She paused. "No, even closer than brother and sister." The two amnesia patients simultaneously translated that statement in their minds. Closer than brother and sister equals not just sibling-like affection equals romantic feelings. Their misunderstanding deepened even further. "Willow, hello." George spoke first, his voice still slightly hoarse. The moment Willow heard him say her name, her heart skipped a beat. Why does his voice sound so good? Low, rich, and magnetic. It was enough to make her ears tingle. "George, hello." Her reply was barely louder than a whisper. Hearing her softly say his name made George's heart skip a beat as well. Why does her voice sound so sweet? Soft and gentle, as if every word carried the sweetness of candy. They looked at each other once more, and once more. They both looked away simultaneously. Mrs. Wang and Mrs. Lu were so excited they nearly hugged each other on the spot. Good heavens! These two children had finally figured it out. It seemed this car accident had turned misfortune into a blessing. Chapter 7. George and Willow's hospital rooms quickly became the liveliest place in the entire hospital. Relatives, friends, business associates, and company executives from both families came in waves to visit. The flowers and fruit baskets they brought piled up until both rooms were overflowing. But what truly made the two rooms stand out were the two patients who spent every day running to each other's room. "Willow, I brought you some porridge. Our family's housekeeper made it. It's light and good for your stomach." George carried a thermal container and sat beside Willow's hospital bed. He had already been discharged. His physical recovery was going well, though his memories remained completely blank. Logically, he should have been resting at home. Instead, he came to the hospital every single day without fail. His stated reason was that spending more time with Willow might help recover their memories, but the real reason was known only to him. "Thank you." Willow smiled softly. She accepted the container and lowered her head, taking small spoonfuls of porridge. The tips of her ears quietly turned red. George sat beside her, watching her eat. His heartbeat immediately sped up again. She looked so adorable eating porridge, small bite after small bite, like a little hamster. Feeling his gaze on her, Willow's cheeks grew even redder. She lowered her head further and focused on drinking her porridge. "How is it?" George asked. "It's good." Willow nodded. "Then I'll bring you some again tomorrow. There's really no need to go to all the trouble." "It's not trouble." The words escaped George before he could stop himself. "Bringing something for you isn't trouble." As soon as he finished speaking, he froze. His ears turned red as well. Good grief. What did I just say? That sounded way too affectionate. Willow was stunned too. Then the corners of her lips lifted uncontrollably. Bringing food for her wasn't a bother. Did that mean he was willing to put in effort for her? The thought made her heart beat even faster. A sweetness spread through her chest as though someone had poured an entire jar of honey into her heart. When a nurse entered for her routine checkup, this was the scene she found. A young man sitting by the bedside, a young woman leaning against her pillow while drinking porridge, both wearing suspicious blushes. The air seemed filled with an indescribably sweet atmosphere. The nurse was experienced enough to understand immediately. With a teasing smile, she said, "My, what a loving couple." Willow nearly dropped her spoon into the bowl. No, we're not." The nurse blinked knowingly. "Oh, not yet." Then she added in a teasing tone, "That's fine. Carry on. I'm just here to take a temperature." After taking the temperature, she left. Behind her remained two people whose faces were red enough to smoke, along with a room overflowing with both awkwardness and sweetness. Scenes like this played out every day. Sometimes George would push Willow's wheelchair through the hospital garden. The two would sit side by side on a bench, chatting casually. Most of the talking came from George. He would tell her about flowers he had seen that day, news he had heard, dishes prepared by the family housekeeper, and all sorts of random things. Even he didn't know why he wanted to tell her every little detail. Willow simply listened quietly. Occasionally she would smile. The smile was faint and gentle, yet to George, it was more beautiful than any flower in the garden. Sometimes Willow would peel fruit for George. She wasn't particularly skilled at peeling apples. The apples always ended up uneven and full of dents. Yet George ate them enthusiastically and repeatedly declared them delicious. Willow said a little embarrassedly, "They look so ugly after I peel them." "Even ugly apples are still apples you peeled," George replied while chewing, his words slightly muffled. Willow's face immediately turned red again. At other times, they did nothing at all. They simply sat together reading books or watching television. Yet as long as the other person was nearby, they felt at ease. It was a strange feeling. They were technically strangers, even though everyone insisted they had known each other for more than 20 years. Yet there was an inexplicable sense of familiarity and closeness between them. Willow thought, "So this is what it feels like to grow up together. Even after losing our memories, our bodies still remember." George thought, "So this is what childhood sweethearts feel like. Even after forgetting everything, my heart still races whenever I see her." Without realizing it, both of them had found what they believed was a perfectly reasonable explanation for the other person's presence in their lives. Chapter 8. 1 week later, Willow was discharged from the hospital as well. On the day of her discharge, George came to pick her up. He was wearing a light gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing a pair of well-defined forearms. His hair had been carefully styled, and his entire appearance was clean and refreshing, so handsome that Willow almost forgot how to breathe. "Have you packed everything?" George asked. He naturally took the bag from her hand and slung it over his own shoulder. "Yes." Willow nodded, her heart as sweet as honey. The two of them walked out of the hospital together. Warm sunlight bathed them as they stepped outside. "Get some proper rest when you get home," George said. "If you need anything, call me. I'll be right next door." "I know." Willow paused before quietly adding, "You should get some rest too." George smiled. His smile was incredibly attractive. The corners of his eyes curved slightly, giving him a youthful charm that contrasted with his usual calm and reserved demeanor. Willow stared for a moment. Before she could stop herself, she blurted out, "You look really handsome when you smile." The instant the words left her mouth, she regretted them. That was way too direct. George was briefly stunned. Then his smile deepened. "If you like seeing it," he said, "I'll smile more often for you." Willow lowered her head. She felt as though her face were on fire. Good heavens, how could he flirt so effortlessly? Their homes were right next to each other. They said goodbye beside the fence separating the two properties. That fence, which had once witnessed countless battles between them, now stood quietly beneath the sunlight, dotted with tiny unknown flowers. George watched Willow walk into her house. Only after she disappeared from sight did he finally turn away, pressing a hand against his still pounding heart. He had only one thought. "My heart races every time I see her. So I've been secretly in love with her all these years. Fortunately, it's not too late." Meanwhile, Willow leaned against the door inside her house, covering her burning cheeks. She too had only one thought. "I blush every time I see him. So I've liked him all these years. Thankfully, I haven't missed my chance." watching the relationship between the two progress at lightning speed. Both sets of parents could barely contain their happiness. Mrs. Wang sent a message. My son brought fruit over to your house again today. I saw it with my own eyes. Mrs. Lu replied. My daughter got a phone call earlier and immediately went out. She said George invited her for coffee. She even dressed up beautifully. Mrs. Wang responded. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. This is definitely happening. Mrs. Lu replied. It's practically guaranteed. Even fate is helping us. The two mothers celebrated wildly in their chat, so excited that they practically wanted to set off fireworks. Meanwhile, the two people at the center of it all remained completely unaware. They were busy living in their own rosy-colored world. They officially became a couple on the second weekend after leaving the hospital. That evening, George invited Willow to stargaze on the rooftop terrace. The top floor of the Wang family villa featured an elegant rooftop lounge, furnished with wicker sofas, warm golden lights, and a small bar. George had arranged flowers and candles in advance, transforming the entire terrace into a scene of breathtaking romance. When Willow arrived, she was stunned by what she saw. Rose petals covered the ground, candlelight flickered gently, and standing among the glowing lights was a young man in a white shirt. Her heartbeat accelerated instantly, her cheeks flushed red. What is all this? She stood at the entrance, suddenly afraid to take another step. George extended his hand toward her. Come here. Willow placed her hand into his. His palm was warm and dry. When he held her hand, his grip tightened slightly, as though he were afraid she might run away. Holding her hand, he led her to the center of the terrace. He guided her onto the sofa. Then he knelt on one knee before her. Chapter 9. Willow was startled. What are you doing? George looked up at her. The candlelight reflected in his eyes, making them shine brightly. Willow, there's something I want to tell you. Then tell me, why are you kneeling? Willow reached out to pull him up. George held her hand and refused to stand. Let me finish first. His expression was serious, so serious that Willow's heart skipped a beat. Although I lost my memory and can't remember what happened between us before, George said. From the moment I woke up and saw you, my heart started racing uncontrollably. I think about you every day. I want to see you. I want to talk to you. I want to watch you smile. I don't know exactly what this feeling is, but I do know one thing. I don't want to lose the chance to be with you. He took a deep breath. His voice trembled slightly. Willow, I want to be with you. Not as your neighbor, not as your childhood sweetheart, but as your partner. Willow stared at him blankly. Without realizing it, her eyes had become red. Her voice trembled. You mean that? I've never been more serious in my life, but we only just left the hospital. George interrupted her. But I can't wait. I'm afraid that if I wait any longer, someone else will steal you away. His words made Willow laugh through her tears. Who would steal me away? I don't know, George admitted, but I'm afraid someone will. Holding her hand tightly, he continued. You're wonderful. I'm afraid someone else might confess before I do. Willow lowered her head. At last, tears rolled down her cheeks. She remembered the porridge he brought her every day in the hospital. She remembered how patiently he pushed her wheelchair during their walks. She remembered the misshapen apple she had peeled and how happily he had eaten it. She remembered how her heart raced every time she saw him. So this was what it felt like to be loved by someone you loved. Wiping away her tears, she said. Then get up. Promise me first. If you get up, I'll promise you. George's eyes lit up instantly. He sprang to his feet. You're saying yes? Blushing furiously, Willow nodded. In a tiny voice, she answered with a single word. Yes. George froze for a second. Then he swept her into his arms and spun her around several times. Put me down. I'm getting dizzy. Laughing, Willow playfully hit his shoulder. George finally set her down, but he refused to let go. Instead, he wrapped his arms around her and rested his chin gently on top of her head. Softly, he said, I'll treat you well, even though I can't remember the past. From today onward I'll remember every single day. I'll remember what you like and what you dislike. I'll remember what you look like when you're happy, and what you look like when you're sad. Willow buried her face against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She felt as though the entire world had fallen silent. Muffled against his shirt, she replied, I'll treat you well too, even though I can't remember the past either. I believe that if we could grow up together before, then we can grow old together in the future. George tightened his arms around her, holding her even closer. Above them, the stars shone brightly. A gentle evening breeze drifted through the air. In the flickering candlelight, the two young figures embraced one another. The scene was as beautiful as something out of a movie. That night, George walked Willow home. When they reached the fence between their houses, neither wanted to say goodbye. Good night, George said, yet he still didn't release her hand. Good night, Willow replied, yet she didn't pull her hand away either. They looked at each other, then smiled. You go inside first, George said. You leave first. I'll watch you go in. Blushing, Willow rose onto her tiptoes and quickly kissed his cheek. Then she turned and ran into the house without even daring to look back. George stood there frozen, one hand covering the spot she had kissed, grinning foolishly, for a very, very long time. Chapter 10. Hidden behind their windows. Mrs. Wang and Mrs. Lu watched the scene unfold and were so excited they nearly started spinning in circles. Mrs. Wang sent a message. He kissed her. He kissed her. He kissed her. Mrs. Lu immediately replied. I saw it too. On the cheek. But that's already a huge step forward. Mrs. Wang sent another message. Oh my goodness. I've finally lived to see this day. Mrs. Lu replied. No. I have to go make Willow a late-night snack. That girl must be over the moon tonight. The two mothers were so excited that neither of them slept all night. As for the two people at the center of it all, they couldn't sleep either. George lay in bed, tossing and turning. His fingers brushed against his cheek, where it felt as though the warmth of that kiss still lingered. It had only been the lightest touch, yet it had left his entire body tingling. He picked up his phone. He wanted to text her, but he worried it might be too late and disturb her rest. After debating with himself for quite a while, he finally sent, Are you asleep? The reply came almost instantly. No. The corners of George's lips lifted. Why aren't you asleep yet? I can't sleep. What about you? George replied. I can't sleep either. Willow sent a blushing emoji. George smiled and typed. What are you thinking about? Trying to sound reserved, Willow replied. Not telling you. George asked. Thinking about me? There was a pause. Then she replied. Yes. That single word sent George's heart rate soaring. Clutching his phone, he rolled across the bed once before forcing himself to calm down. Then he typed. I've been thinking about you too. Willow replied. Aren't we being a little too lovey-dovey? Are we? I don't think so. We just started dating. Isn't this moving too fast? George thought for a moment before replying. We've known each other for more than 20 years. It's not fast at all. Seeing that message, Willow found it perfectly reasonable. That was right. They were childhood sweethearts who had known each other since they were little. Even if she couldn't remember it, the instincts of her body couldn't be lying. Feeling completely justified, she continued being affectionate. All right then. Good night. See you tomorrow. George replied. Good night. See you tomorrow. Sweet dreams. You too. After putting down their phones, both of them drifted off to sleep wearing foolishly happy smiles. News of George and Willow becoming a couple quickly spread throughout the upper-class circles of City A. At first, nobody believed it. People discussed it everywhere. The Wang and Lu families forming a marriage alliance. No way. Those two families have been rivals for years. George and Willow, weren't those two always at odds with each other? I heard they fought fiercely over business deals. How could they possibly end up together? But before long, reality proved everyone wrong. George and Willow's first public appearance as a couple took place at a charity gala. That evening, Willow wore a wine-red evening gown. Her long hair was elegantly pinned up, revealing her graceful neck. With flawless makeup and breathtaking beauty, she looked absolutely stunning. George wore a black suit. His tie matched the color of her gown, clearly chosen with care. He was already handsome by nature, but dressed in formal attire he appeared even more distinguished and charming. The moment they entered the ballroom arm in arm, the entire venue fell silent for a second. Every eye turned toward them. There was surprise, curiosity, disbelief. Ignoring the countless stares, George and Willow calmly greeted everyone with effortless elegance. Only their tightly clasped hands revealed the intimacy of their relationship. Eventually, someone couldn't hold back any longer. President Wang. Miss Lu, are you too? George smiled, lowering his head slightly. He glanced at Willow. His gaze was so gentle it seemed capable of melting hearts. Willow is my girlfriend. The moment those words left his mouth, sharp gasps echoed throughout the room. Girlfriend. George and Willow. Good heavens. The business elites exchanged glances. Every one of them saw the same shock reflected in the other's eyes. If the Wang and Lu families truly united through marriage, the entire business landscape of City A would have to be reshaped. Meanwhile, the socialites of the city collectively wore heartbroken expressions. George had been the most sought-after bachelor in City A, and now Willow had won his heart. As for the talented young men who had admired Willow, their expressions were no better. Beneath the elegant atmosphere of the ballroom, currents of shock and speculation flowed everywhere. Only the two people at the center of the storm remained completely oblivious. Lost in their own sweet world, they had eyes only for each other. Chapter 11. Are you tired? Do you want to go sit over there for a while? George lowered his head to look at Willow, his voice so gentle it was almost unbelievable. Okay. Willow nodded obediently. The two walked to the lounge area. George brought her a glass of juice. It was warm. He knew she shouldn't be drinking anything cold these days. Willow accepted the juice, warmth spreading through her heart. She had never even told him that. How did he know everything? That was the benefit of being childhood sweethearts, she thought. Even the smallest details reflected their unspoken understanding. Halfway through the gala, several business associates pulled George away to talk. Willow remained seated in the lounge by herself. A few socialites soon approached her. Their smiles were pleasant, but their words carried hidden barbs. Willow, are you really dating young Master Wong? Yes. Willow nodded politely. One socialite wearing a pink dress smiled sweetly. You're so lucky. Young Master Wong treats you incredibly well. He never leaves your side. Beneath the smile, however, was unmistakable jealousy. Willow pressed her lips together. Yes, we only started dating recently, and he's a little clingy. Her tone was calm. The subtle brag hidden within it was nearly impossible to detect. The smiles on the socialites' faces stiffened. Holding her juice elegantly, Willow rose to her feet. Excuse me, George is waiting for me. Walking gracefully in her heels, she made her way to George's side. Naturally, she slipped her arm through his and tilted her head up with a smile. The moment George saw her smile, he instinctively smiled back. Then he reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was natural, intimate, and impossible to miss. Countless eyes in the ballroom witnessed it. The socialites' expressions immediately worsened. Meanwhile, the curve of Willow's lips rose just a little higher. Keep staring. He's my boyfriend. In her imagination, a tiny version of herself was standing proudly with her hands on her hips, laughing victoriously. After the gala ended, the two returned home together. Inside the car, Willow leaned back in her seat, still smiling. Had a good time today? George asked while driving. She nodded. Now that we've gone public, we won't have to hide anymore. George laughed. Who said we were hiding? Haven't we always been completely open about it? Tilting her head, Willow said. Not completely. We just hadn't officially announced it. So now that it's official, you're happy? Very happy. She turned to look at him, her eyes sparkling. Now you officially have a girlfriend. Let's see who still dares to set their sights on you. George chuckled. So that's what this is really about. Of course. Willow let out a small huff. Do you know how many people have been interested in you? Now it's perfect. If anyone tries to make a move on you again, they'll only embarrass themselves. As she spoke, her chin lifted slightly. She looked like a little kitten fiercely guarding her favorite food. George found her adorable. Unable to resist, he reached over and ruffled her hair. Hey! Willow immediately protected her hairstyle. What was that for? George laughed. Don't worry, no one's taking me away. He withdrew his hand. His tone was casual, yet absolutely certain. I only like you. Willow felt her heart take another direct hit. Lowering her head, she felt the tips of her ears turn red. How is he getting better and better at saying things like this? The car entered the villa district and stopped in the shared driveway between their neighboring homes. We're here. George turned off the engine but didn't immediately get out. Neither did Willow. They sat quietly for a few moments. Then George spoke. Today, He paused before continuing. When we went public today, how did it feel for you? Willow thought carefully before answering. It felt like finally landing on solid ground. Landing on solid ground? She nodded. Yes, before. Everything felt a little unreal, like I was living inside a dream. But today, with so many people seeing us together, it suddenly felt real. She paused. Her voice softened. It felt like this is how things were always meant to be. George turned and looked at her. The interior lighting was dim. The shadows softened her profile, making her look even more beautiful. Willow. He called her name quietly. What is it? George looked at her for a moment. Then he asked softly. Can I kiss you? For a split second, Willow forgot how to breathe. Chapter 12. The air inside the car seemed to freeze. It was so quiet that they could almost hear each other's heartbeats. Okay. Willow's voice was as soft as a feather. George leaned closer. One hand rested against the seat. The other gently cradled the back of her head. His movements were slow, as though giving her every opportunity to change her mind. But Willow didn't pull away. She closed her eyes and tilted her face up slightly. Then his warm lips touched hers. It was an incredibly gentle kiss. Their lips met for only a brief moment before separating. Yet even such a fleeting touch sent both of their heartbeats racing so wildly that they felt they might explode. George pulled back slightly and looked into her eyes. Her eyelashes trembled softly. Her cheeks were red like the evening sunset. Willow. He called her name again. His voice was hoarse. Willow opened her eyes and met his deep gaze. Instantly, her heart melted. This was my first kiss, she whispered. Was it yours too? George paused for a moment before smiling. I don't remember whether it was my first, but I'm certain it was the best one. The sweet words left Willow completely dizzy. She lightly punched him on the shoulder. How are you so good at saying things like that? I'm just telling the truth. George caught her hand and gently kissed her knuckles. Come on, let me walk you home. He got out of the car, walked around to her side, opened the door for her, and took her hand. Then he escorted her all the way to her front door. Good night. They spoke in unison, then both laughed. Standing on tiptoe, Willow kissed him lightly on the chin. Immediately afterward, she turned and ran into the house. George remained where he was. He touched his chin, then his lips, then stood there grinning foolishly for quite a while before finally heading home. News of George Wang and Willow Lu's relationship caused a tremendous sensation throughout City A's business world. The Wang Group and Lu Group had competed against each other for years. Now these two corporate giants were suddenly on the path to becoming one family. How were other companies supposed to compete? For a time, all sorts of rumors spread everywhere. Some claimed it was a carefully planned marriage alliance designed to combine the resources of both families and dominate City A's market. Others insisted it was a strategic move orchestrated by the two family patriarchs, with George and Willow merely serving as pieces on the chessboard. Some even dug up old stories about the two competing fiercely for business deals and confidently declared that the relationship was fake, that it was all an act. Naturally, those rumors eventually reached George and Willow. George's reaction was simple. He scoffed, leaning comfortably against the sofa while scrolling through his phone. He said, "A business marriage? They're overthinking things. We're clearly childhood sweethearts who fell in love naturally. How did that turn into a business marriage?" Sitting beside him and reviewing documents, Willow looked up. "People can say whatever they want. As long as we know the truth, that's enough. You really don't care?" George asked. "What would I care about? They don't know we grew up together. They don't know that we..." She paused. Her cheeks turned pink. "They don't know that we like each other." The moment George heard the words "we like each other," a deeply satisfied smile appeared on his face. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders and pulled her into his embrace. "You're right. As long as we know, that's all that matters." Leaning against his chest, Willow continued reading her documents. After a while, she suddenly said, "Although, now that I think about it, our families really are a good match." George immediately looked pleased with himself. "Of course, you're amazing, and I'm not exactly lacking either. We're perfectly matched." Willow laughed and pushed him lightly. "Look at you, showing off." "That's not showing off, that's just a fact." George spoke with complete seriousness. "Think about it. We were born on the same year, the same month, and the same day. We grew up together. Our families are equally matched. Our abilities are equally matched. We even lost our memories together. If that isn't fate, what is?" Willow found herself completely unable to argue. Blushing, she simply lifted the document higher to hide her face. George reached over and pulled the file from her hands. Then he lowered his gaze to meet hers. "Willow, Let's get married." Chapter 13. Willow froze. "What did you just say?" "I said, let's get married." George repeated himself, his expression more serious than she had ever seen. "I've thought about it. We're going to get married sooner or later anyway. So why not do it sooner? I want the first person I see every morning when I wake up to be you, and the last person I see every night before I fall asleep to be you. I want to be with you, not as boyfriend and girlfriend, but as husband and wife." Willow stared at him blankly. The moment she blinked, tears rolled down her cheeks. "Why are you crying?" George panicked. He quickly reached over to wipe away her tears. "Am I moving too fast? If you don't want to get married so soon, that's okay. We can wait." "I do." Willow interrupted him. The tears flowed even faster. "I do." George froze for a second. Then he pulled her into his arms and hugged her so tightly it felt as though he wanted to merge her into his very bones. "You really mean it?" His voice trembled. Willow nodded vigorously against his chest. "I do." The two of them stayed like that for a very long time, simply holding each other, neither speaking a word. Eventually, Willow was the first to pull away. Her eyes were still red as she asked, "So when exactly are you going to propose? You can't seriously expect to marry me just because you casually threw out one sentence, can you?" George laughed. "Don't worry, I'll make sure the proposal is done properly. Nothing will be missing." "Good." Willow finally smiled through her tears. "That's more like it." When the news reached the ears of the two mothers, Mrs. Wang and Mrs. Lu nearly cried from happiness on the spot. Mrs. Wang sent a message. "My son is going to propose." Mrs. Lu replied instantly. "Really? Ah. Am I dreaming? Somebody pinch me." "Not a dream, not a dream, not a dream. They really together, and they're getting married." Mrs. Wang typed. "More than 20 years. I've finally lived to see this day. Heaven has answered my prayers." Mrs. Lu replied. "Don't say another word. I'm already crying. All our years of effort weren't wasted. It was worth it." The two mothers tearfully celebrated together through their chat messages. After decades of matchmaking, their grand plan had finally achieved complete success, and George kept his promise. The proposal was planned down to the smallest detail. He reserved the highest revolving restaurant in City A, 300 meters above the ground. He created a proposal setting straight out of a dream. Everywhere Willow looked, there were champagne roses, her favorite flowers. Rose petals formed a winding path that stretched from the elevator entrance all the way to the observation windows. On both sides of the path stood countless photographs, pictures of them growing up together, photos from their childhood, photos from their school years, photos from business events they had attended together, and photos from after they began dating. Alongside every photograph was a small card containing words he wanted to say to her. At the end of the path stood George, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, holding a bouquet of roses. His palms were sweating from nervousness. He had lost his memories, but he was absolutely certain of one thing. This was the most important moment of his life. Willow was brought to the restaurant entrance with a blindfold over her eyes. The moment it was removed, she stopped walking entirely. A flower-lined pathway stretched before her, and at the end stood the man she loved most. Beneath a sky filled with sparkling lights, his tall figure stood against the glow behind him. He looked so handsome that he seemed like the male lead of a romantic drama brought to life. Willow took a step forward, then another. Slowly, she followed the trail of rose petals. Every time she reached a photograph, she stopped to look, and every time she looked, her eyes grew a little redder. There was a picture of her and George at 4 or 5 years old, playing with mud in the courtyard. Both of their faces were covered in dirt. Both were laughing without a care in the world. There was a picture of them wearing school uniforms at a school event, standing side by side, young, innocent, beautiful. There were photographs from business functions, elegant gowns, sharp suits, a perfectly matched pair. And then there were the photos George had secretly taken after they started dating. Her drinking porridge, her reading a book, her basking in the sunlight in the garden, her sleeping peacefully. Every single photograph captured a different moment, but they all had one thing in common. Each one showed the Willow he saw through his own eyes. Chapter 14. At last, Willow could no longer hold back her tears. They streamed down her face in great drops. By the time she reached George, she was already crying uncontrollably. Looking at her tear-streaked face, George felt both heartbroken and amused. He gently wiped away her tears. His voice was impossibly tender. "Stop crying. If you keep crying, you won't look pretty anymore." Sniffling, Willow asked, "If I'm not pretty, will you still marry me?" "I will." George smiled. Stepping back, he raised the ring box in his hand. "No matter what you look like, I'll marry you." The ring box opened. Inside was a dazzling diamond ring. The diamond was neither too large nor too small, but its flawless cut reflected brilliant light beneath the lamps. "Willow." George looked at her with complete sincerity. "I may not remember when we first met. I may not remember when we first held hands, or when we first hugged, but I will remember today forever. I will remember this moment forever. From today onward, my memories belong only to you, and my future belongs only to you. So, will you marry me?" Through her tears, Willow nodded desperately. "Yes. Yes, I will. I will. I will. I will." George smiled. His smile shone brighter than the stars above. Carefully, he removed the ring from the box and slipped it onto her ring finger. Then he pulled her into his arms. Thunderous applause and cheers erupted all around them. Beyond the observation windows, the countless lights of City A glittered like a river of stars. Willow buried her face against George's chest. Listening to the strong rhythm of his heartbeat, she felt that this was the happiest moment of her entire life. Meanwhile, somewhere beneath the night sky 300 meters below, the truck driver who had run the red light and crashed into them sat in prison eating a plain steamed bun, completely unaware of everything. One could only imagine how complicated his feelings would be if he ever learned that a single traffic accident had led to the marriage alliance between the two most powerful families in City A. The wedding was scheduled for 3 months later. The season chosen was autumn, the most beautiful time of year in City A. The Wang and Liu families organized the event together. The scale of it was so extravagant that it became known as the wedding of the century. The venue was a private estate owned by the Wang family. The entire property was transformed into a sea of flowers. The cost of the flowers alone could have funded dozens of ordinary weddings. The two families reserved every 5-star hotel in City A to accommodate out-of-town guests. The wedding banquet menu was jointly designed by 3 Michelin-starred chefs. Every ingredient was flown in from elsewhere. Even the bottled water was imported. The budget for the wedding was probably enough to purchase a small island. On the wedding day, the autumn sky was clear and bright. Sunlight poured down over the estate. Dressed in a custom-made wedding gown, Willow stood by the second-floor window and looked down at the bustling preparations and endless flowers below. A strange sense of unreality washed over her. She was really going to marry George, the man who had made her heart race from the very first moment she opened her eyes after the accident. The man who treated her with endless tenderness and care. The childhood sweetheart she had secretly loved all along. "Willow, are you ready?" Mrs. Lu pushed open the door and stepped inside. The moment she saw her daughter in her wedding dress, her eyes instantly reddened. Her daughter was getting married today, and she was marrying the very young man Mrs. Lu had always wanted for her. At last, all of her tireless efforts over the years had not been in vain. "Mom, don't cry." Willow quickly spoke up. "If you cry, I'm going to cry too." All right. Mrs. Lu wiped away her tears. "No crying." Carefully adjusting Willow's veil, she smiled. "Our Willow looks absolutely beautiful today." Suddenly, Willow asked, "Mom, can I ask you something?" "What is it?" "George and I, were we really that close when we were kids?" For the briefest moment, Mrs. Lu's smile froze, but she quickly recovered. "Of course, the two of you were inseparable growing up. You were closer than anyone." Willow nodded. The last trace of doubt in her heart disappeared. That made perfect sense. After all, every time she saw George, her heart raced uncontrollably. She must have liked him long before the accident. Chapter 15. On the lawn below, the wedding march began to play. Accompanied by her father, Willow walked step by step along the flower petal-covered aisle toward the men waiting beneath the floral arch. Today, George was dressed in a white suit. His hair was styled flawlessly. Standing there, he looked like a prince who had stepped straight out of a fairy tale. The moment he saw her, his eyes lit up. They shone as though the entire galaxy had been poured into them. Once again, Willow's heartbeat accelerated uncontrollably. The feeling was so familiar. Ever since the first moment she had seen him after waking up in the hospital, every encounter had been like this. She had always interpreted it as the power of love, and she believed it completely. Her father spoke solemnly. "I'm entrusting my daughter to you." "Thank you, Dad." George accepted Willow's hand and held it tightly. Standing face to face, they listened as the officiant spoke. Or rather, neither of them listened very carefully. Their eyes were fixed entirely on each other. Nothing else seemed to exist. "Mr. George, do you take Miss Willow as your lawful wife, to love her, honor her, and cherish her in times of prosperity and adversity, in wealth and poverty, in health and sickness, for all the days of your life?" "I do." George's answer was firm and unwavering. "Miss Willow, do you take Mr. George as your lawful husband, to love him, honor him, and cherish him in times of prosperity and adversity, in wealth and poverty, in health and sickness, for all the days of your life?" "I do." Willow's voice trembled slightly with emotion. "Then please exchange rings." The moment the ring slipped onto her ring finger, tears finally spilled from Willow's eyes. "Now, the groom may kiss the bride." George lifted her veil, then lowered his head and kissed her. Thunderous applause and cheers erupted from every direction. Flower petals drifted down from above like a colorful rainstorm. Willow closed her eyes and melted into his kiss. Only one thought remained in her heart. For the rest of my life, it will be him. At the same time, George thought, for the rest of my life, it will be her. The guests were deeply moved by the beautiful wedding, but there were two people whose emotions were a little different from everyone else's. Mrs. Wang and Mrs. Lu. The two women watched the newlyweds kissing on stage and quietly clasped each other's hands. In a low voice, Mrs. Wang said, "We did it." Mrs. Lu sighed emotionally. "More than 20 years. It was worth it. It was worth it." The two exchanged smiles. Their expressions carried not only joy but also the relief and lingering fear of narrowly escaping disaster. So close, just a little closer, and those two stubborn rivals might have spent their entire lives fighting each other. Thankfully, fate had stepped in. One car accident, one case of amnesia, and everything was solved. Heaven truly was the greatest matchmaker of all, the ultimate supporter of their favorite couple. Chapter 16. Life after marriage was even sweeter than when they were dating. George and Willow moved into another small villa on the Wang family estate. They lived close to George's parents while still having their own private space. The arrangement was just right. Every morning, George would wake up a little earlier than Willow, prepare breakfast, and then return to the bedroom to wake her up. His method of waking her was special, not an alarm clock, not a gentle shake, but a soft kiss. "Willow, time to get up." Willow groggily opened her eyes the moment she saw his handsome face so close to hers. The corners of her lips naturally curled upward. "Morning." She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulled him closer, and kissed him back. "Morning." George's voice carried a smile. "Breakfast is ready. Come eat." "Don't want to get up." Willow stayed curled up in bed like a lazy cat. "Then should I feed you?" "No." Willow finally opened her eyes fully and sat up. "I have a meeting today. I need to get to the company early. I'll drive you there." George said. "No need. You're busy too. I'm driving you." George's tone left no room for refusal. "It's on my way." Willow laughed. The Wang group and the Lu group were in completely opposite directions. If that was on the way, it was quite a detour. But she didn't expose his little excuse. Instead, she obediently got up, washed up, and sat at the dining table to enjoy the breakfast he had made. George's cooking skills were surprisingly good. Fried eggs, bacon, toast, simple breakfast foods. Yet he prepared them with remarkable skill. Did you cook often before? Willow had asked him once. I don't remember. George thought for a moment. But when I make these, everything feels very natural. I probably already knew how before. The truth was that George really had known how to cook before, and Willow was the reason. Back in their teenage years, he once heard his mother mention that Willow had signed up for a cooking class. The very next day, he enrolled in an even more advanced culinary course and even showed off his completion certificate in front of her. After losing his memory, that competitive little chapter of his past had been forgotten, but the skills remained, and now every one of those skills was being used to take care of Willow. Fate really worked in mysterious ways. In the evenings, if neither of them had business engagements, they would take walks together around the neighborhood, hand in hand. They would stroll slowly beneath the rows of plane trees, chatting casually as they walked. They talked about work, life, funny things that had happened during the day, and plans for tomorrow. They could talk about anything, or talk about nothing at all. Even walking quietly together like that felt wonderful. Sometimes, when they passed the fence between their two family homes, Willow would sigh emotionally. Did we play around here when we were kids? Probably, George said. Too bad I can't remember. It's okay. Willow squeezed his hand. We'll make new memories here in the future. George smiled and nodded. What he didn't tell her was that every time they passed that fence, he felt something strange. He couldn't quite describe it. It felt as if something important had been forgotten. He figured it was probably related to his childhood memories. On weekends, the two of them would stay at home and watch movies together. Willow loved romance films, and George always watched them with her. Although he couldn't help complaining whenever an overly dramatic plot twist appeared, he still watched with great interest. George teased her. The last time you watched that movie about lovers separated by amnesia, you cried while watching it, and then ended up cursing the screenwriter. Willow immediately protested. That's because the screenwriter was too cruel. They obviously could have been together, but they just had to create some ridiculous misunderstanding to separate them. Yes, you're right, George said helplessly. Good thing there are no misunderstandings between us. Leaning against his chest, Willow replied as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Of course there won't be. We're childhood sweethearts who love each other. George rested his chin on top of her head, his smile exceptionally gentle. They were probably the very definition of childhood sweethearts. Even though he couldn't remember the past, it didn't matter. They had an entire lifetime ahead of them to create new memories together. Chapter 17. 6 months after their wedding, Willow discovered that she was pregnant. That morning, she held the pregnancy test in her hand and stared at the 2 red lines. She froze. George was in the kitchen frying eggs when he noticed that there had been no movement from the bathroom for quite a while. He put down the spatula and walked over. Willow, what's wrong? The door opened. Willow stood at the doorway holding the pregnancy test, the complicated expression on her face making his heart tighten instantly. What happened? He asked nervously. Willow held the test out to him and said in a dazed voice, "Look." George lowered his head. 2 lines. His brain stopped working for 3 full seconds. Then he suddenly looked up, his eyes shining like searchlights. You're pregnant. Willow nodded. I'm going to be a father. George immediately swept her into his arms and spun around the hallway several times. I'm going to be a father. Willow, you're pregnant. I'm going to be a father. Keep your voice down. Willow laughed as she lightly punched his shoulder. Mom and Dad are still asleep. George put her down, but he was still so excited that he didn't know what to do with himself. He paced around her anxiously. Are you tired from standing? Do you want to sit down? Are you thirsty? Hungry? What do you want to eat? Something sour? Or spicy? People always say sour cravings mean a boy and spicy cravings mean a girl. Calm down, Willow said, both amused and helpless as she stopped him. I just found out. There's no need to be this nervous. George held her hand and said seriously, how can I not be nervous? Starting today, you need to cut back on work and stop overexerting yourself. We need to adjust the meals at home. I'm going to look up pregnancy nutrition plans right now. Stop, Willow interrupted. I'll take care of myself. Don't treat me like I'm made of glass. George replied confidently. You are made of glass. No, you're even more precious than that. Willow burst out laughing. Her heart felt so warm that it nearly melted. When the news reached both families, the excitement it caused was comparable to the year both companies had gone public at the same time. Mrs. Wang was so happy that she immediately distributed cash bonuses to every employee in the company. Mrs. Liu, meanwhile, brought out every health supplement she had at home and made a lengthy list of things she planned to use to nourish her daughter. We're going to be grandparents. George's father posted the message in the family group chat, followed by a long string of fireworks and celebration emojis. Willow's father immediately followed with another string of fireworks emojis. The group chat was instantly flooded with congratulations and celebrations. becoming as lively as New Year festivities. George carefully stored the pregnancy test away, insisting that he wanted to keep it as a souvenir. Willow looked at him with disgust. Why would you keep that? This is the first proof that our child existed, George said seriously. It's going into the family scrapbook someday. Willow shook her head with a smile. Sometimes this man could be adorably childish. From that day onward, George Wong officially entered future father mode. He bought a mountain of parenting books and spent every evening after work reading them. He studied harder than students preparing for college entrance exams. He covered every sharp corner in the house with protective padding, replaced every electrical outlet with child-safe versions, and had already started designing the nursery. Willow was speechless. The baby isn't even born yet. Why are you in such a hurry? George replied with complete confidence. Preparation prevents problems. He also downloaded countless pregnancy tracking apps on his phone. Every day they reminded Willow what she should eat, what exercises she should do, and what nutrients she should be taking. The apps were more punctual than her own reminders. Willow felt that she had probably been spoiled by this man beyond repair. One evening, she wrapped her arms around his waist and buried her face against his chest. In a muffled voice, she said, "George, have I ever told you how much I love you?" George smiled, lowering his head. He kissed the top of her hair. "You have, but I don't mind hearing it again. I love you. I love you too." The two embraced quietly. Outside the window, the setting sun painted the entire room in warm shades of orange and red. At that moment, Willow felt that she was the happiest woman in the world. Chapter 18. The due date was in spring, the season when flowers bloomed and birds filled the air with song. Willow was admitted to the VIP maternity suite of the finest private hospital in City A. George stayed by her side every moment, never leaving her. Both families were also waiting at the hospital, ready to welcome the arrival of a new life. The contractions began one early morning. When Willow woke from the pain, dawn had only just begun to break. At first, she thought it was ordinary fetal movement, but she quickly realized it was labor. "George," she nudged the sleeping George beside her. George woke up almost instantly. "What's wrong? Are you feeling unwell?" "I think it's time." Willow's voice trembled slightly. George shot upright in bed, his eyes widening dramatically. "It's time." He frantically pressed the call button, then helped Willow sit up while trying to comfort her as they waited for the doctors. His voice was shaking. His palms were drenched in sweat, yet he was still desperately trying to appear calm. "Don't be scared. Don't be scared. The doctor will be here any second. Take deep breaths." "Right. Deep breaths." Willow was covered in sweat from the pain, but when she saw him acting even more nervous than she was while stubbornly pretending everything was under control, she couldn't help laughing. George looked completely confused. "What are you laughing at? You're even more nervous than I am." "How could I not be nervous?" Even his voice was trembling. "If it hurts, just squeeze my hand or pinch me." Before he could finish speaking, the nurses and doctors entered with their equipment. What followed felt like a chaotic battle. Willow was wheeled into the delivery room. George changed into sterile clothing and stayed beside her, holding her hand and repeating words of encouragement over and over again. "Willow, you can do this. He'll be here soon. Just hang on a little longer. I love you. You're amazing." The pain was so overwhelming that Willow was nearly losing consciousness. Her entire world narrowed down to two things: pain and George's voice. She gripped his hand with all her strength, her nails nearly digging into his skin. Then a loud cry suddenly shattered the tense atmosphere in the delivery room. "Congratulations. It's a boy. Both mother and child are healthy." The nurse carried the wrinkled, red-faced little baby over to Willow. She looked at that tiny, wrinkled face. She heard his strong, powerful cries. Tears immediately welled up in her eyes. This was her child. Her and George's child. And then, it was as if a bolt of lightning split apart the fog inside her mind. As if a door that had been tightly locked for over 20 years had suddenly been smashed open. Memories came flooding back. Every single one of them. Everything. She remembered it all. At 4 years old, competing with him in the yard with remote-controlled airplanes. At 7, staying up late solving advanced math problems just to beat him. At 10, fighting fiercely against him in a piano competition in the school lounge. At 14, when he disgusted her with glue at the school gate and she retaliated by stomping on his foot. At 18, when they posed for graduation photos with fake smiles, only to turn around and practically gag afterward. At 22, after returning home, when they fought each other in the business world, stealing deals and competing until their faces turned red with frustration. The day of the car accident, she had gotten into his car. The entire ride had been spent in silence. Every scene, every emotion, every moment of gritted teeth and bitter rivalry, every confrontation and clash, all of it came rushing back into her mind in a single instant. Willow's eyes widened. Her entire body froze. She remembered. She remembered everything. George was her lifelong arch-rival. They were not sweet childhood sweethearts at all. They were mortal enemies who had been at each other's throats since childhood. The reason her heart raced whenever she saw him was because she was angry, not because she liked him. And she had actually married him. She had carried his child. And just moments ago, she had given birth to his son. Chapter 19. Willow suddenly turned her head and looked at George. He was holding their newborn son, smiling like a complete fool. His eyes were red, as if he had secretly cried a few moments earlier. One of his fingers carefully touched the baby's cheek, so gently that it seemed he was afraid of damaging some priceless treasure. Then he turned around and met her gaze. His smile was dazzling. Willow, look, our son. He's so tiny, so adorable. Seeing him smile like that made the anger inside Willow surge higher and higher. She remembered everything. The man who had just made her go through childbirth was her lifelong archrival. And she had actually given birth to his child. Yet he was standing there looking so happy. A powerful wave of indignation and fury rushed straight to her head. Willow took a deep breath and gathered every last bit of strength she had left after giving birth. George. The roar was earth-shattering. It echoed throughout the entire delivery room. George nearly threw their son into the air from fright. What happened? What happened? Are you uncomfortable somewhere? Willow summoned every ounce of strength she had left and shouted the sentence that was destined to become legendary in the histories of both the Wang and Lu families. I'm going to have 8 children with you, exhaust you to death. The delivery room fell silent. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then a nurse holding a clipboard looked up. She adjusted her glasses and sighed emotionally. What a sweet love story. George was speechless. Willow was speechless too. That was not what she meant. But the nurse had already immersed herself completely in her own romantic interpretation. Clutching her clipboard, she practically floated out of the delivery room while muttering to herself. So sweet, so unbelievably sweet. Willow weakly closed her eyes. Dear heavens, are you messing with me? Willow, the heir to Lu Industries, the youngest female CEO in City A's business world, a genius blessed with an IQ of 140, had somehow married the men she had disliked since childhood. How exactly had her life ended up like this? As for the culprit behind everything, George was still holding their son, looking at her with complete concern. Willow, are you okay? Was it too painful just now? Should I call the doctor to take another look at you? Willow opened her eyes and stared at the face that had made her heart race for more than 20 years. She took a deep breath. Forget it. She wouldn't settle accounts with him today. Once she finished her postpartum recovery period, then she would calculate every single debt between them. Chapter 20. The news of Willow recovering her memories exploded like a bomb, shattering the peaceful lives of both the Wang and Lu families. The first person to realize something was wrong was Mrs. Lu. She had been standing outside the delivery room when Willow shouted, I'm going to have 8 children with you and exhaust you to death. While the other relatives were wiping away tears of emotion, Mrs. Lu felt her heart skip a beat. Then a terrifying thought surfaced in her mind. That tone. Why did it sound so much like the old Willow? Filled with unease, Mrs. Lu quietly slipped into her daughter's hospital room while Willow was resting after the delivery. Willow, did you remember something? Leaning against the hospital bed, Willow gave a weak smile. The smile carried a familiar murderous intent that made even her own mother shiver. Mom, I remembered everything. Mrs. Lu's legs nearly gave out beneath her. What exactly did you remember? Willow replied coldly. I remembered how you and Aunt Wang compared us since childhood. How you spent years plotting to push us together after we grew up. How you packaged 2 lifelong enemies as childhood sweethearts. She spoke each word slowly and clearly. I remembered all of it. Mrs. Lu's vision darkened. It was over. Everything was over. More than 20 years of hard work were about to collapse before her eyes. Willow, listen to me. Let me explain. No need. Willow waved a hand dismissively. I'll settle my own accounts. The meaningful smile at the corner of her daughter's lips sent another chill down Mrs. Lu's spine. She quietly retreated from the room and immediately called Mrs. Wang. Mrs. Wang, this is terrible. What happened? Aren't Willow and the baby both safe? Willow recovered her memories. The line went silent for a full 10 seconds. What did you just say? Willow recovered her memories. She remembered everything. Mrs. Lu's voice was on the verge of tears. She knows we deceived her. She knows she and George were archrivals. When she said she wanted to have 8 children with George and exhaust him to death, that wasn't a confession of love. That was a declaration of war. Mrs. Wang sucked in a sharp breath. Then what do we do now? I have no idea. Mrs. Lu was practically pacing in circles. She just gave birth, so she's still weak. But once she recovers, Mrs. Wang, you don't understand Willow's temper. If she remembers all the ways George used to provoke her, this absolutely isn't going to end quietly. Mrs. Wang blurted out. Then hurry up and make George recover his memories too. If he remembers the past as well, Then both of them can be angry together. Wouldn't that balance things out? Mrs. Liu froze. That's certainly a unique way of thinking. The problem was that George's memories remained perfectly sealed away. There wasn't the slightest sign of them returning. At that moment, George was sitting beside Willow's hospital bed, looking at his wife with complete confusion. Willow, if you really like children, we can have more in the future. But isn't 8 a little too many? Be quiet. Willow cut him off irritably. George obediently shut his mouth. However, he still had absolutely no idea what was going on. He felt that Willow's temper had worsened after giving birth, but he attributed it to postpartum emotional changes. If Willow knew what he was thinking, she would probably be so furious that she would leap out of the hospital bed on the spot. Unfortunately, she was simply too exhausted. She had just given birth, then her memories had come crashing back all at once, both physically and mentally drained. She had no extra energy left to settle accounts with George. Closing her eyes, she decided to focus on recovering first. The reckoning could wait. Thus, a bizarre Cold War quietly began inside the maternity ward. More accurately, it was a one-sided Cold War. George had absolutely no idea he was being given the cold shoulder. He assumed Willow was simply exhausted and didn't feel like talking. As a result, he became even more attentive and caring. From Willow's perspective, however, it was like pouring oil onto a fire. Every time she saw his attentive face, all she could think about were those years when he deliberately shot down her proposals during meetings or stole projects from her while wearing that infuriatingly smug grin. Infuriating. Absolutely infuriating. But what annoyed her most was this. Even now, he could still make her heart race whenever he got under her skin. 20 years had passed, and that had never changed. Chapter 21. The days Willow spent in the hospital became the darkest period of her life. On one hand, she had to endure the pain and discomfort of recovering after childbirth. On the other hand, she had to endure George's constant care and attention. Every gentle look, every thoughtful word, each one reminded her of how thoroughly she had been fooled by these appearances and how she had actually believed he genuinely cared about her. Of course, he was sincere now, because he had lost his memory, and that only made her angrier. A lifelong archrival with amnesia had completely wrapped her around his finger. How pathetic was she? What made it even worse was that she would occasionally glance at him, and her heartbeat would still skip. She knew it was anger. It was the competitive instinct buried deep in her bones. But during the period when she had lost her memory, she had mistaken that feeling for romantic attraction and believed it wholeheartedly. And now she knew the truth. Yet her heart still sped up uncontrollably whenever she saw him. That cursed reflex made her feel as though her own body had betrayed her. Lying in bed, Willow ground her teeth together and mentally cursed the heavens 10,000 times. What kind of ridiculous arrangement was this? First she lost her memory, then she married George. Then she gave birth and suddenly recovered her memories. What was this supposed to be? A buy one get one free package? Even more infuriating was the fact that the baby looked like his father. Whenever the nurses brought the baby over for feeding, Willow would stare at the tiny face that looked remarkably like George's and feel emotions too complicated to describe. The baby was her own flesh and blood. Of course she loved him, but because he looked like George, every time she held him, it felt as though she were holding a miniature version of her lifelong rival. It was a very strange feeling. Baby, don't grow up to be like your father, Willow whispered softly. Just take after your mother. Remember that. Okay. The infant blinked at her, then he let out a tiny yawn. What kind of attitude is that? Mommy is talking to you. The baby blinked again. Then his lips curled into a smile. The nurses had already explained that babies this young smiled only because of involuntary muscle movements. But Willow was still completely defeated by that smile. Lowering her head, she kissed his forehead. Her heart felt both sweet and aching. Forget it. For the baby's sake, she would spare George's life for now. On the day she was discharged from the hospital, George had arranged everything perfectly. Willow, the car is here. Let's go home. He carefully supported her arm as though she were a fragile piece of porcelain. Willow allowed herself to be guided along with an expressionless face. Meanwhile, her inner thoughts were running wild. How had she never noticed before that he was this annoying? A grown man had compared dozens of baby car seat brands and even made an Excel spreadsheet. Was he insane? She had completely forgotten that during the period of her amnesia, she had been moved to tears countless times by that very same attentiveness. As the car passed the fence separating the Wang and Liu family homes, Willow's gaze darkened. Back then, she had been the proud daughter of the Liu family. He had been the arrogant young master of the Wang family. Each ruled their own territory on opposite sides of the fence. Whenever they met, they argued. They were utterly incompatible, like fire and water. And now, she sat inside his car, holding his child. On the way back to their shared home, the joke fate had played on them was not funny at all. Chapter 22. After returning home, Willow began her long postpartum recovery period. According to tradition, she wasn't supposed to be exposed to wind, touch cold water, or overwork herself. She was expected to stay in bed and focus entirely on recovery. For someone as busy and driven as Willow, it was pure torture. What made it even more torturous was the person keeping her company, George. George took an entire month off from work to stay home with her and the baby. He handed all company matters over to the vice president and declared that even if the sky fell, it still wouldn't be more important than Willow and their child. That sentence had once moved the amnesiac Willow to tears. Now, hearing it only made her want to laugh sarcastically. Oh, so I'm important now. You've completely forgotten how you used to compete with me for business deals. Still, Willow didn't explode. She was a smart woman. She knew this wasn't the right time for a confrontation. Her body hadn't fully recovered. She couldn't devote her full attention to the company yet. And she glanced at George's face. It was so gentle and completely lacking in hostility. The man was still suffering from amnesia. Picking a fight with someone who couldn't remember anything would make her seem petty, even if that person had been a complete jerk before losing his memory. So Willow decided to stay patient. First, recover. Then settle the score with George little by little. But staying patient didn't mean remaining passive. Willow launched her own postpartum psychological warfare. First move, hot and cold treatment. George brought over a bowl of chicken soup. Willow, the chicken soup is ready. Willow accepted the bowl expressionlessly and took a sip. It was actually quite delicious. Still, her face remained completely blank. It's okay. A flash of disappointment crossed George's eyes, but he quickly pulled himself together. Then drink a little more. There's plenty left in the pot. Willow lowered her head and continued drinking. From the corner of her eye, she caught his disappointed expression and the way he was forcing himself to stay cheerful. And somehow, she felt a little guilty. No. Why should she feel guilty? This was George, her lifelong archrival. Willow immediately scolded herself internally. Then she proceeded to finish every last drop of the soup. Second move, verbal strikes. Willow, look. The baby opened his eyes. George held their son in his arms, his face filled with excitement and wonder. Look at his eyes. They look like yours. They're beautiful. Leaning against the bed, Willow lazily glanced over. Then she casually replied, his nose looks like yours. George immediately brightened. Really? Let me see. He carefully examined the baby's face. You might actually be right. Willow added. Yeah, just like your big nose. George's smile froze. Is my nose really that big? Willow didn't answer. She simply gave him a meaningful smile. Holding the baby, George fell into a deep existential crisis about the size of his nose. Third move, comparison attacks. One day, Mrs. Wang came to visit her grandson. Unable to put the baby down, she sighed emotionally. He looks exactly like George when he was little. It's like they were made from the same mold. Willow immediately joined in. That's true, Mom, but he's a little more handsome than George. His features are more refined. Mrs. Wang blinked. Then she burst out laughing. Yes, definitely more handsome than George. George listened from the side. Something felt wrong, very wrong, yet he couldn't quite figure out what it was. Fourth move, random questions. Late one night, after the baby had fallen asleep, the room became quiet. The two of them lay in bed without speaking. Suddenly, Willow broke the silence. George, what would you do if one day you discovered that our relationship in the past wasn't what you think it was? George paused and turned toward her. What do you mean? Exactly what I said. George thought for a moment. Then he answered seriously. I don't know what our relationship used to be like because I can't remember it, but I know what it's like now, and I know what I want it to become in the future. Turning onto his side, he reached out and took her hand in the darkness. No matter what happened before, it won't change how I feel about you. What I remember is you, the you I've spent the past 6 months living with, and that's enough for me. His voice was calm and sincere. For a moment, Willow couldn't find a response. The hand holding hers was warm, steady, exactly like the person he had become after losing his memory, and that only made everything more complicated. Chapter 23. Willow fell silent in the darkness. Her heart was racing again. Damn it. How was this man even better with words after losing his memory than he had been before? She turned over, presenting her back to him, and muttered, "Go to sleep." George gently wrapped his arms around her from behind, burying his face against the back of her neck. He spoke softly, "Good night, Willow." Willow stiffened for a moment. Then she forced herself to relax. Forget it. For the sake of how sincere he was. No. She couldn't go soft. Staring into the darkness, she repeatedly reminded herself, "Willow, stay strong. He's your archrival. Don't let him fool you." But George's steady breathing was right beside her ear. His warm chest rested against her back. His heartbeat was calm and strong, beating steadily again and again. Without realizing it, she gradually relaxed, and before she knew it, she had fallen asleep. The next morning, when she woke up, she discovered that at some point during the night she had turned around. Her entire body was curled up in George's arms. Her face was buried against his chest. One arm was even wrapped around his waist. Willow was speechless. Carefully, she withdrew her hand. Then she slowly tried to move away, hoping to escape the suffocating position before George woke up. Morning. George's voice sounded above her head. Rough with sleep, Willow froze instantly. He was already awake. Then that meant he had seen every bit of her sneaky attempt to escape. Did you sleep well? George looked down at her, smiling. Not bad. Willow sat up with forced composure. Meanwhile, the tips of her ears quietly turned red. Damn it, damn it, damn it. Weren't they supposed to be mortal enemies? How had they ended up cuddling again? Standing in front of the bathroom mirror, Willow gave herself a disappointed look. Her body simply refused to listen to her. Her mind knew perfectly well that she was supposed to dislike him, but her body remembered the intimacy they had shared over the past 6 months. It instinctively moved closer to him, leaned against him, responded to his embraces and kisses. The conflict between her rational mind and her body's habits left Willow trapped in a constant internal battle every single day. Meanwhile, George remained completely unaware. All he knew was that Willow seemed emotionally unstable after giving birth. Sometimes she was cold toward him. Sometimes she unconsciously sought his closeness. After researching countless articles about postpartum recovery, he learned that emotional fluctuations were perfectly normal after childbirth. As a result, he became even more considerate, even more patient. Living beneath the same roof, the two of them carried entirely different thoughts in their hearts. Yet somehow, they managed to create a strange kind of harmony. And so, amidst that peculiar harmony, the postpartum month passed day by day. Chapter 24. Willow's declaration in the delivery room that she was going to have 8 children spread through both family social circles at astonishing speed. It all started with the nurse in the delivery room. She had been so touched by what she believed was a grand romantic confession that she immediately shared the story with her co-workers. The co-workers told their friends. Those friends posted it on social media. Screenshots spread into group chats. Group chats led to more screenshots. Within just a few days, the story of the Liu heiress publicly confessing her love to the young master of the Wang family after giving birth and declaring she wanted 8 children had spread throughout all of City A. Recently, Mrs. Liu's phone had barely stopped ringing. Every call was from wealthy socialites offering congratulations. Mrs. Liu, I heard your daughter wants to have 8 children for the Wang family. Their relationship must be wonderful. Are they planning to start a soccer team? Mrs. Liu could only laugh awkwardly and play along. Inside, however, she was suffering. You people have no idea what that girl actually meant. Mrs. Wang found herself dealing with exactly the same situation. Mrs. Wang, 8 children. The Wang family line is secure for generations. On the surface, Mrs. Wang smiled politely. Inside, she was growing increasingly nervous. She knew Willow too well. That had not been a sweet promise. It had been a declaration of war delivered through gritted teeth. She immediately sent Mrs. Liu a message. Should we do something? Mrs. Liu replied. Do what? They're already married and have a child. We can't exactly make them divorce. Mrs. Wang responded. Of course not. My grandson was just born. Mrs. Liu replied. Then what do we do? Willow holds grudges. She's definitely planning something right now. Sigh. Let me think. The two mothers once again fell into another round of strategic planning. Meanwhile, inside the Wang family villa, Willow was lounging on the sofa, scrolling through her phone. She was reading a gossip thread popular among City A's business circles. The title read, Breaking News. More drama in the Wang-Liu marriage alliance. Liu heiress makes emotional postpartum confession. Declares she wants 8 children. The comments below were endless. One user wrote, I'm obsessed. They're so sweet. Another commented, the ultimate rich family romance. I volunteer to protect this love story. A third added, 8 children. Young Master Wang, did you hear that? Your wife is urging you. Another highly liked comment read, I'm confused, but not completely confused. Actually, I look confused, but not really confused. To me, it's not confusing at all. I'm just confused by how sweet it is. The sweetness is what's confusing me, not the confusion itself. So compared to whether I'm confused or not confused, I'm mostly confused by the sweetness. Willow scrolled through the comments with a completely expressionless face. Not a ripple stirred in her heart. Heh. She closed the app. Then she slowly turned toward George. The murderous intent in her eyes was impossible to hide. George, meanwhile, remained completely oblivious. At that moment he was engaged in an intense battle with a diaper. Willow, how exactly does this diaper work again? I swear I remembered it last time. Fold the left side in first, then pull it up and fasten it. Willow delivered the instructions in a flat voice. Oh, like this? George fumbled awkwardly for a while. Finally, he succeeded. With a relieved sigh, he announced proudly, "Done. Dad is amazing." He lifted their son triumphantly and gave him a little bounce. Then he turned toward Willow. "Oh, right, Willow. About what you said before, about having 8 children. Were you serious?" The corner of Willow's mouth twitched. "What do you think?" George thought carefully. Then he answered with complete sincerity, "I think 8 is way too many. 3 would be enough. Mainly because having children is too hard on you. I don't want you to suffer through that so many times." His expression was serious. His tone was earnest. His eyes were gentle. Willow's heartbeat skipped once again. Annoyed, she immediately looked away. Damn it, did this man even realize what he was saying? Willow. Noticing her silence, George leaned closer. "What's wrong? Are you feeling unwell?" His face suddenly appeared right in front of hers. She could even feel his breath brushing against her cheek. Willow's heartbeat instantly shot through the roof. She shoved his face away. "I'm going to sleep." Then she fled the scene as quickly as possible, like a soldier retreating from an unwinnable battle. Chapter 25. George stood there holding his son, looking completely confused. "Your mom seems to be in a bad mood lately, little guy." He lowered his head and spoke seriously to the baby. "But that's okay. We need to be understanding of her, all right?" The baby blinked. Then he broke into a smile. "You think so too, right? Good boy." George kissed his son's chubby cheek, completely unaware that he was currently resting comfortably at the top of his wife's blacklist. The day Willow finished her postpartum recovery period, she felt as though she had finally come back to life. 1 month without washing her hair. 1 month without leaving the house. 1 month of being treated like a national treasure. She never wanted to experience that kind of life again. The first thing she did was take a long, comfortable shower. Then she headed straight to the company to announce her return. The employees of Willow Industries were visibly relieved when they saw their vice president appearing at the office full of energy and confidence. Over the past month, countless rumors had been circulating. "Vice President Liu, congratulations on the birth of your son." "Vice President Liu, you've recovered so quickly. No one would ever guess you just had a baby." Willow smiled gracefully and responded to each greeting. Elegant, confident, commanding. She looked completely different from the woman who had spent the past month silently fuming over George's existence. However, the moment she returned to her office and closed the door, the smile disappeared. A newly prepared industry report sat on her desk. The title on the first page read, "Comparative Analysis of Recent Projects, Wang Group vs. Willow Industries." The report had been commissioned during her postpartum recovery. She simply hadn't had time to read it until now. Leaning back in her chair, Willow slowly flipped through the pages. The further she read, the more shocked she became. During the months of her pregnancy, George had indeed taken a month off to stay home with her after childbirth. But before that, under his leadership, the Wang Group had been thriving. Several major projects that Willow had been monitoring had ultimately been secured by the Wang Group. One line in particular was highlighted in the report. Under the leadership of Vice President George Wang, the Wang Group has achieved remarkable market share growth over the past 6 months and has become Willow Industries' largest competitor in City A. Willow stared at the words largest competitor. The pen in her hand nearly snapped. Competitor. That word was all too familiar. Throughout her entire life, George had always played the role of her competitor, comparing grades, comparing abilities, comparing business performance, competing in every measurable aspect imaginable. Suddenly, a long-forgotten memory resurfaced. It had happened shortly after they returned to the country. Both companies were bidding on a massive mixed-use commercial development project. She and her team had worked through several sleepless nights, creating what she believed was the perfect proposal. Then, on the day the winner was announced, the Wang Group secured the contract. By a margin of a single point. George had been standing beside her, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, wearing that infuriatingly smug smile. He had even extended a hand toward her. "My thanks, Miss Liu." At the time, she had nearly driven the heel of her shoe directly into his foot. That had been their normal dynamic, always confronting each other, never backing down, neither willing to concede an inch. But now he spent every day circling around her, calling her Willow, telling her he loved her. Chapter 26. The contrast left Willow with extremely complicated feelings. She had to admit it. The amnesiac George was genuinely a wonderful person. Gentle, considerate, almost every quality she had ever imagined in an ideal partner. But the problem was, this man, before losing his memory, had been her lifelong archrival. Were all those gentle gestures and thoughtful actions just an act? The same way he used to pretend to be well-behaved in front of adults when they were children? No, that wasn't right. He had lost his memory now. There was no reason for him to keep pretending. Then did that mean that deep down, he had always been a good person, and that their hostile relationship had simply blinded them both? The more Willow thought about it, the more confused she became. Finally, She slammed the report shut in frustration. She decided not to think about it for now. After all, the child had already been born. The marriage had already happened. No amount of score settling could change those facts. Instead of dwelling on the past, she should focus on how to deal with him in the future. If he remained amnesiac forever, then she could pretend their old grudges had never existed and simply live their lives peacefully. But what if he recovered his memories one day? Willow narrowed her eyes. A meaningful smile appeared at the corner of her lips. Then it would be time for revenge. Every grievance repaid. Every score settled. When she arrived home, George was wandering around the living room with their son in his arms. "You're back. Are you tired? Have you eaten?" A barrage of questions immediately came flying her way. After changing her shoes, Willow took the baby from his arms and kissed the infant's cheek. "I ate. I'm not tired." Her answers were brief. Then she sat down on the sofa. George followed her and sat beside her. After hesitating for a moment, he finally spoke. "Willow, do you have some kind of problem with me lately?" Willow raised an eyebrow. "Why would you ask that?" "Just a feeling." George scratched his head, looking genuinely confused. "Ever since the baby was born, you've been much colder toward me. Did I do something wrong?" Willow was silent for a moment. Had he done something wrong? Strictly speaking, the amnesiac George had done nothing wrong. The one who had done wrong was the George who still had his memories, but she couldn't exactly explain that, so she brushed it off. "No, you're overthinking." "Really?" George didn't sound convinced. "Then why haven't you talked to me much lately? And why won't you let me hold you while we sleep anymore? And why do you keep glaring at me?" Willow immediately interrupted him. "When did I glare at you?" At the same time, she unconsciously shot him a glare. "You just did." Willow was speechless. Taking a deep breath, she forced a smile onto her face. "I said nothing's wrong. Stop imagining things." George looked at the smile. It was obviously forced. The confusion in his heart only deepened. Still, he didn't press further. He simply nodded. "Okay, I understand." Then he stood up. "I'll go make dinner." Watching his figure disappear into the kitchen, Willow leaned back against the sofa. A strange irritation rose within her chest. She wasn't unaware of how carefully he was trying to please her. She hadn't missed the confusion in his eyes, or the hurt he tried to hide. But every time she remembered that he was George, the man who had competed with her for more than 20 years, anger immediately surged up inside her. Yet what fault did the amnesiac George actually bear? Looking down at the baby in her arms, Willow found him staring back at her with wide, bright eyes. His clear pupils reflected her image perfectly. She spoke softly. "Baby, am I being unfair?" The baby let out a tiny coo, as if answering her question. Willow sighed. Then she gently rested her forehead against his. Her thoughts were a complete mess. Chapter 27. As the days passed, the baby grew day by day. The wrinkled, red little monkey who had just been born gradually transformed into a fair, chubby little bundle of joy. He could smile. He could fuss. He could roll over. He was so adorable it should have been illegal. George's love for his son had already reached an outrageous level. He bought an entire room full of toys. Everything from infant rattles to electric toy cars. The collection covered practically every stage of childhood from birth to 10 years old. "He's only 3 months old." Willow stared at a remote-controlled airplane labeled ages 8+ and looked utterly speechless. "Why did you buy this?" George replied confidently. "I'm stocking up in advance, then I won't have to buy it later." Willow picked up a children's microscope. "And this one? It says suitable for ages 12 and up." George examined it thoughtfully. "This feels like the kind of toy I would have loved when I was a kid, but it looks unfamiliar. So I probably never got one. I'm making up for it by buying it for our son." "Didn't you have everything you wanted when you were growing up?" George froze. "How do you know that?" Willow's heart skipped a beat. She immediately corrected herself. "I heard it from Mom. Aunt Wong said you never lacked anything when you were little." George didn't seem suspicious. He merely smiled. "Maybe I had a lot of things, but there were some toys I never got around to playing with before I grew up. Buying them for our son feels like making up for those missed opportunities." He said it casually. Yet Willow suddenly felt a pang of sympathy. She remembered how strict the Wong family had been with George when they were children. There weren't many toys. Studying always came first. And the reason she knew that was because her own mother had constantly used George as an example. "Look at George from the Wong family. He never wastes time playing with toys. He's always studying. You should be like that too." Of course, the truth was that George wasn't unwilling to play. He simply wasn't allowed to. As a result, Willow herself had also lost countless opportunities to play with toys. When all was said and done, it was still his fault. The moment Willow reached that conclusion, her brief sympathy instantly disappeared. She snorted and tossed the microscope back into the mountain of toys. Watching the ever-changing expressions on her face, George became even more suspicious. He had begun noticing something lately. Willow often knew things she shouldn't know. Details about his childhood, his old habits, even some of the business decisions he had made before losing his memory. One day, he finally couldn't resist asking, "How did you know I negotiated that acquisition deal before?" Without changing her expression, Willow lied smoothly. "I heard it from my dad." George nodded slowly. Then he asked another question. "Then how do you know I drink American coffee without sugar?" "I don't remember ever telling you that." Willow fell silent for a moment. Then she answered confidently. "You told me yourself. You just forgot." "Did I?" "You did. You have amnesia. It's normal not to remember." George was only half convinced. Still, he didn't pursue the matter, but the feeling remained. Willow knew too much about him. Far too much, more than someone could reasonably learn from other people. It felt less like something she had heard, and more like something she had personally experienced. There was something else that bothered him as well. Sometimes, when he looked at her, fragmented images would suddenly flash through his mind. A glimpse of her sitting in the back seat of his car, her profile illuminated by the setting sun, the cold, distant tone she used when saying thank you. The woman in those memories seemed completely different from the gentle and charming Willow he knew now. He had no idea whether those images were real memories or simply hallucinations. Whenever he tried to focus on them, they vanished, like bubbles popping in the air. The feeling left him increasingly uneasy, as though he had forgotten something extremely important, and whatever it was, it had something to do with Willow. That night, just before they went to sleep, George suddenly asked, "Willow, could you tell me about our past?" Willow's body stiffened slightly. "Our past?" "Yeah." George turned onto his side and looked at her. "I don't remember anything, but I want to know." His voice was gentle. "You seem to remember more than I do. Could you tell me whatever you remember? Please?" Chapter 28. Willow remained silent in the darkness for a long time. What was she supposed to tell him? Tell him how they had disliked each other since childhood? Tell him how they had sabotaged one another in the business world? Tell him how merely seeing him was enough to make her heart race with anger? In the end, she spoke. Her voice was calm. "We grew up together. Our families were neighbors and got along well. We went to school together, attended events together, and competed with each other." Competed? George immediately caught that word. Willow quickly added, "Healthy competition, the kind where you compare grades and abilities. We pushed each other to improve." That wasn't entirely a lie. At least the competition part was true. And then, George asked, "Then we went abroad for college. You were in the United States, and I was in the United Kingdom. We didn't really keep in touch during those years. And after that, after graduation, you joined the Wong Group and I joined Lu Industries. Since both companies operate in the same industry, competition was unavoidable. We occasionally crossed paths in business." Willow carefully chose her words, keeping them as neutral as possible. "Then came your grandfather's birthday banquet. You came to pick me up. There was a car accident. We both lost our memories." George was quiet for a moment. "Then, what was our relationship like before?" His tone carried uncertainty. "Was it good?" Willow opened her mouth. Countless memories flashed through her mind. At 4 years old, glaring at each other through the fence. At 10, battling each other at the piano in the lounge. At 14, locked in silent warfare throughout school. As adults, clashing openly in the business world. Then, the next second, she heard herself answer, "It was all right." Her tone was so calm that it sounded like she was talking about strangers. Not particularly good, not particularly bad, just ordinary childhood friends, I guess. George nodded thoughtfully. Then he asked another question. "Did I like you before?" This time, Willow was silent even longer. She remembered his cold expression on the day of the accident. She remembered him arriving to pick her up. She remembered how he hadn't even looked directly at her when telling her to get in. She remembered the icy silence inside the car, a silence so cold it could have frozen the air itself. "Maybe," she answered softly. A trace of melancholy slipped into her voice without her even noticing. "Maybe even you didn't know." George didn't ask anything else. Instead, he reached out and held her hand. "It's okay. No matter what happened before, right now, I like you, and I'll keep liking you in the future." Willow didn't answer. In the darkness, her eyes remained open. She stared silently at the ceiling. A flood of indescribable emotions churned inside her heart. Should she believe those words? If this had been the old George, she wouldn't have believed a single one. But now he had lost his memory. Now he spoke with such sincerity. She believed him. Damn it, she actually believed him. Chapter 29. Life continued in that strange and delicate balance. The baby grew his first tooth. Then he learned how to roll over by himself. Then how to sit. Then how to crawl. Every milestone excited George as much as it excited a child. "Willow, look, the baby can say Dad now." One day, George burst into her study carrying their son. his smile so bright it was almost blinding. Willow looked up from her work, seeing the face that had become even softer since he became a father. She couldn't quite describe what she felt. That wasn't Dad. She looked utterly unimpressed. He just said, "Ah." He was definitely saying, "Dad." George insisted stubbornly. Then he lifted their son high into the air, making the little boy burst into giggles. "Say it again, Dad." "Ah." The baby immediately cooperated. "See." George turned triumphantly toward Willow. He said it. Willow shook her head helplessly, yet the corners of her lips couldn't stop themselves from lifting slightly. Over the past 6 months, her relationship with George had slowly evolved. At first, they had been lifelong enemies forced to live together. Then they became familiar strangers, then reasonably harmonious roommates. And now, even Willow couldn't find the right word for what they were. She still occasionally remembered the past, and whenever she did, she still got angry, but those feelings of anger were gradually being diluted by newer memories. Memories of him getting up at 3 in the morning to feed their son so she could sleep a little longer. Memories of him staying by her bedside when she had a fever, worrying more about her than he worried about the baby. Memories of him sending photos and videos of their son every day whenever she was busy at the office, saying that the baby missed his mother, when in reality, it was George who missed her. Sometimes she wondered, if she had never regained her memories, wouldn't living like this have been perfectly fine? Unfortunately, memories didn't come with an undo button. Once they returned, just as she couldn't erase the 20-plus years of rivalry and conflict between them. Meanwhile, George seemed to be getting closer and closer to the truth he had forgotten. He had started having strange dreams. In one dream, he was a little boy playing with a remote-controlled airplane in the yard. Then he noticed a girl next door flying an identical plane, and hers flew higher than his. In another dream, he sat at a piano competing against a girl. Neither of them was willing to stop, even after their fingers became sore. In another dream, he drove to pick up a girl. After she got into the car, she sat in the back seat. Neither of them spoke during the entire ride. The atmosphere was cold enough to freeze. Every time he woke from these dreams, he was drenched in sweat. His heart raced uncontrollably. The face of the girl in those dreams was becoming clearer and clearer. It was Willow. But the Willow in those dreams was completely different from the Willow he knew. The Willow in his dreams had cold eyes, a mocking smile. She seemed wrapped in a layer of ice. She was nothing like the gentle, adorable wife who could act shy and affectionate around him. The dreams left George increasingly confused. He couldn't shake the feeling that the story he had been told about their past wasn't the whole truth. One day, he finally couldn't hold back any longer. "Were our relationship not very good before?" Willow was reviewing documents when he asked. Her hand paused slightly. "Why would you ask that?" George hesitated. Then he decided to tell her. "I've been having dreams lately." He looked at her carefully. "In those dreams, you seem to really dislike me." Chapter 30. Willow put down the document and looked at him. George didn't avoid her gaze. There was confusion in his eyes, and beneath that, a faint trace of unease. Willow sighed inwardly. It wasn't exactly dislike. She carefully considered her words. It was more competition. We were compared to each other too much growing up, so there was some hostility between us. Hostility? George frowned slightly. Willow nodded. Childhood emotions come and go quickly. She brushed over the topic lightly. Things got much better after we became adults. Really? Really? Willow smiled faintly. Otherwise we wouldn't be together now, would we? That answer seemed to reassure George. He nodded and didn't ask any more questions. What he failed to notice was that Willow had said now, not before. Before long, their son turned 1 year old. The Wang and Liu families jointly hosted a grand first birthday celebration. During the traditional selection ceremony, the little boy crawled around a pile of symbolic objects, carefully examining each one. In the end, he grabbed a company seal in one hand and a bank card in the other. Drool hung from his smiling face. He's clearly destined to inherit the family businesses. The guests immediately showered him with compliments. Both sets of grandparents were so happy they could hardly stop smiling. After the banquet ended, George drank a little more than usual. Not enough to be drunk, just enough to leave him pleasantly lightheaded. He led Willow out onto a balcony overlooking the night. The early summer breeze carried a gentle warmth. "Willow," he called her name softly. Have I ever told you that I'm grateful for the car accident?" Willow's body stiffened slightly, leaning against the railing. George looked at her with bright eyes softened by alcohol. "If that accident hadn't happened, I might never have realized how much I like you." His smile carried a touch of self-mockery. "Maybe we'd still be competing against each other, just like before." Willow opened her mouth. She wanted to say something, but no words came out. George suddenly asked, "Was I a jerk before?" "Not that bad." The answer came out with difficulty. George chuckled. "Then I'll treat you twice as well from now on. I'll make up for whatever I owe from before." His expression was completely sincere. Okay. Willow looked at him. Under the moonlight, his eyes seemed impossibly bright. She had spent more than 20 years looking at that face, the face that used to irritate her more every year. Yet at that moment, an indescribable emotion rose within her chest. She opened her mouth, preparing to answer. Then a heavy truck drove past somewhere in the distance. The roar of its engine tore through the night. The sound was identical, exactly the same as the truck that had barreled toward them on the day of the accident. George's expression froze. His pupils contracted violently. His entire body went rigid, as though something had struck him head-on. Then, memories crashed into his mind like a tidal wave. At 4 years old, glaring at each other over a fence. At 7, competing over grades. At 10, battling each other at the piano. At 14, waging silent wars across campus. At 18, pretending to be polite. At 22, tearing each other apart in the business world. The day of the accident, he had gone to pick her up with extreme reluctance. She had sat in the back seat, cold as ice. Then, the violent impact, the deafening crash, the endless darkness, everything, every single memory, came back. Chapter 31. George swayed slightly. The color drained from his face in an instant. George? Sensing that something was wrong, Willow immediately grabbed his arm. What happened? Slowly, George turned his head and looked at her. Under the moonlight, her face overlapped with the cold, arrogant Willow from his memories. Then it overlapped with the gentle, lovable wife he had spent the past 2 years with. The two images kept shifting, merging, separating, colliding. His archrival, his wife, the person he had disliked throughout his childhood, the woman he had loved for nearly 2 years. They were the same person. You. His voice was painfully hoarse. You remembered a long time ago, didn't you? Willow's expression changed as well. Looking at his pale face and the storm of emotion swirling in his eyes, she knew the moment had finally arrived. Yes. She released his arm and took a step back. Her voice was frighteningly calm. I remembered on the day I finished my postpartum recovery. Then these past 6 months. Yes. Willow cut him off. A strange smile appeared at the corner of her lips. For the past 6 months, I've known exactly who you are. I knew you were my childhood archrival. I knew we'd been fighting for more than 20 years. I knew we disliked each other from beginning to end. Taking a deep breath, she finally poured out everything she had been holding back. Well, George? Are you angry now? George opened his mouth. His thoughts were a complete mess. Angry? Yes, he was angry. The Willow in his memories. The arrogant woman who always opposed him. The nightmare of his childhood. The greatest rival of his career. But she was also his wife. The woman who had survived the accident with him. The woman who had rebuilt a life alongside him after losing their memories. The woman who had given birth to his son. The woman standing beneath the moonlight glaring at him right now. Two completely different emotions crashed together violently inside his chest. The impact left him struggling to breathe. Finally, he managed to speak. You, what about me? Willow lifted her chin. She was ready. Ready for the fierce confrontation that had been delayed for more than 20 years. What do you want to say? You want to settle scores? Come on. We can go through 20 years of debts one by one. She never finished the sentence, because George suddenly grabbed her wrist. Then he pulled hard. Before Willow could react, she was dragged straight into his arms. And then, he kissed her. Willow's eyes widened. Her mind went completely blank. This kiss was aggressive. Nothing like the gentle kisses he had given her before. It felt as though 20 years of suppressed emotions had finally found an outlet. Anger, frustration, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite identify. All of it poured into that kiss. Willow could barely breathe. Her heart pounded so violently that it felt ready to burst from her chest. Damn it. The racing heartbeat was happening again. She tried to push him away, but her arms seemed to have developed a mind of their own. Instead, they wrapped around his neck. A very long time passed before George finally released her. Both of them were breathing heavily. Their foreheads rested against each other. Under the moonlight, their eyes shone with startling intensity. George's voice was rough. There was even a hint of gritted teeth frustration in it. You were right. We do have a lot of scores to settle. He loosened his hold on her and looked deeply into her eyes. But not tonight. Tonight, there's only one thing I want to tell you. He paused. Then he spoke slowly. Even now that I've remembered everything, those feelings haven't changed. I'm still saying the same thing. In this lifetime, I only want you. Willow stared at him blankly. Suddenly, her eyes turned red. She shot him a fierce glare, yet her voice betrayed her completely. It came out soft and helpless. You're insane. Then, without another word, she rose onto her tiptoes and kissed him back, fiercely. Under the moonlight, their intertwined shadows stretched long across the ground. Far away, another truck rumbled down the road, but this time, its roar was scattered and carried away by the night wind. Chapter 32, Epilogue. Dad. Mom said you two used to be arch rivals. Is that true? Their 3-year-old son sat on George's lap, tilting his little face upward as he asked the question with complete seriousness. George glanced at Willow. She was lounging on the sofa with a cup of coffee in hand. The corners of her lips curled into an amused smile as she clearly enjoyed watching the situation unfold. Yes. George looked back at his son and smiled. We used to be rivals. The boy tilted his head. Then what about now? Are you still rivals? George thought for a moment. Then he set his son down, walked over to the sofa, and leaned down to place a gentle kiss on Willow's forehead. Now. He answered his son while keeping his eyes on Willow. Now we're rivals. And lifelong partners. The little boy turned toward Willow again. What about Mom? Willow set down her coffee cup. She wrapped an arm around George's neck and planted a loud kiss on his cheek. Smiling, she said, Mom too. I'm going to compete with your dad for the rest of my life. Suddenly, the little boy raised a tiny fist into the air and loudly declared. Then our 8 kids can compete too. Willow's smile instantly froze. She turned toward George, who said anything about 8 children. George immediately raised both hands in surrender. Not me. The little boy spoke in his adorable childish voice. You did, Mom. Grandma said that when you were having me, you shouted it in the hospital. She said you wanted to have 8 children with Dad. A lot of people heard it. Grandma said she was so touched she cried. He paused, then added curiously. Oh, Mom, what does exhaust him to death mean? The color rushed into Willow's face so quickly it was visible to the naked eye. M.O.M. She practically shouted through gritted teeth. Outside the window, in the neighboring Liu family villa, Mrs. Liu suddenly sneezed. Then she silently got up and closed the curtains. George watched his wife's flustered expression and burst out laughing. Reaching out, he pulled her into his arms. If you really want 8 children, then 8 it is. Lowering his head, he whispered into her ear. We have a whole lifetime ahead of us. We can take our time. Blushing furiously, Willow punched him hard in the chest. Then she buried her face against him. Yet the corners of her lips quietly curved upward. A few kilometers away, inside a prison cell, the truck driver who had once run a red light and crashed into their car sat by a window, gazing at the sky. He only had 1 month left before his release. Fortunately, nobody had died in the accident. He had sworn to himself that once he got out, he would never run another red light for the rest of his life. Still, he had vaguely heard rumors. Apparently that accident had somehow led to an extraordinary romance. Guess I managed to do one good deed after all, he muttered to himself. Then he went back to eating the steamed bun in his hand.